The Principate of Tiberius, Sections 1 to 2. Section 1. Accession of Tiberius. It was generally regarded as a matter of course that Tiberius should step into the place of Augustus. The Roman world did not dream of a revolution, and it was felt that a monarchy naturally fell to him, who stood in the same relation to the now divine Augustus as Augustus himself to the divine Julius. Men universally acquiesced in the succession of Tiberius as the heir, the adopted son, the chosen cohort of the deceased emperor. But though such feelings moved men's minds, constitutionally, the empire was elective, not hereditary, and the Senate and the people could, without infringing the constitution, have conferred the principate on someone wholly unconnected with the Julian family. Augustus had himself named 3 nobles who might possibly compete with Tiberius: Lepidus, who was equal to the position but despised it; Asinius Gallus, who might desire it but was unequal to it; and Arruntius, who was not unworthy of it and would dare to seek it if a chance were offered. But even from Arruntius, Tiberius had nothing to fear. The only possible rival seemed to be his own kinsman, his nephew Germanicus, who was absent in Gaul, and Agrippa Postumus, who was still pined in the island to which his grandfather had banished him. The unlucky Agrippa was slain by his gaoler immediately after the death of Augustus, and there can be no doubt that the order for his execution was given either by Tiberius or by Livia. When the death of Augustus was announced, Tiberius, by virtue of the tribunician power which he had received in the preceding year for an indefinite period, convoked the Senate. He had already given the watchword to the praetorian cohorts, and sent dispatches to the legions as if he were formally emperor. It is not quite clear whether this was formally an act of usurpation, for it might have been held that the proconsular imperium, which Tiberius possessed before the death of Augustus, having been bestowed by a decree of the Senate and not being merely derived from the imperium of the Princeps, did not cease on the death of the Princeps. In any case, the act seemed an anticipation of his election to the Principate, and Tiberius afterwards made a sort of apology for it to the Senate. But Senate and people, consuls and prefects, took an oath of obedience to him without a sign of hesitation. The proconsular imperium was renewed or confirmed, and the various rights which had been granted to Augustus by separate enactments were conferred upon him doubtless by single comprehensive law, lex de imperio. Tiberius, indeed, adopting the maxims of statecraft which he had learned from his predecessor, feigned reluctance to assume the immense task of directing such a vast empire, and suggested that the functions of government should be divided among more than one ruler. But it was easily seen that the suggestion was not intended seriously. It was part of the transparent comedy which was played henceforward between the Senate and the Princeps. It is important to observe that the practice adopted by Augustus of assuming the empire for a defined period of years was now abandoned. On the other hand, Tiberius would not assume it for life. No term was fixed, but he intimated his intention of resigning the Principate when the state no longer needed him. Here again no one took his words as seriously meant. The first care of Tiberius was the funeral and deification of Augustus. The dead body was borne by senators to the Campus Martius, where it was burned and the ashes were bestowed in the imperial mausoleum. Funeral orations were pronounced both by Tiberius and by his son Drusus. The Senate decreed temples and priests to the Divus Augustus, who was thus raised to place beside his father, the Divus Iulius. His will, which had been deposited in the charge of the Vestal Virgins, was read before the Senate and thus published abroad. It bequeathed 2/3 of his fortune to Tiberius, and the remainder to Livia, who was to be adopted into the Julian family and bear the name Augusta. If these heirs failed, 1/3 of the property was to descend to Drusus, the son of Tiberius, and the remainder to Germanicus and his 3 sons. But these legacies were considerably diminished by the large donations which were left to the citizens and to the praetorian and legionary soldiers. Along with his fortune, the old emperor bequeathed, in his Breviarium Imperii, some councils of government. He deprecated the admission of provincials to the privileged position of Roman citizens. He condemned the further extension of the frontiers of Roman dominion, and he advised that as many men of ability as possible should be engaged in the administration of public affairs. It seems probable that the second of these councils specially regarded the conquest of Transrhenane Germany, and we shall see how Tiberius acted on it. Section 2. Germanicus on the Rhine. The first weeks of the reign of Tiberius were disturbed by mutinies in the Rhine and Danube armies. Discontent had long been smouldering, and had only been hindered from bursting forth by respect for the old emperor. The soldiers who defended the German frontiers contrasted the hardships which they were obliged to endure in harsh climates and remote regions, the small pay which they received, the unduly long term of service, and the inadequate provision awaiting them at its expiration, with the easy life and the higher pay of the praetorian guards, who could look forward to gifts of land in Italy itself. On the news of the death of Augustus, mutinies broke out simultaneously on the Danube and on the Rhine. The Pannonian army, consisting of 3 legions, under the command of Julius Blasius, threw off the authority of their general, and demanded that the term of service should be reduced from 20 to 16 years, and that the veterans should receive their pensions in money. Blasius was forced to send his son to Rome, to bear these demands to the new emperor, and in the meantime the troops vented their pent-up wrath on the centurions, whom they most detested and refused to perform their military duties. Tiberius dispatched some praetorian cohorts under his son Drusus to treat with the mutineers and restore order, but sent no definite message of concession. The soldiers were enraged when they discovered that Drusus was instructed to evade rather than comply with their demands, and the young prince was with difficulty rescued from their fury. But an eclipse of the moon opportunely took place. The superstitious soldiers were alarmed, and, seized with a fit of remorse, they listened to the indefinite promises of Drusus and returned to their allegiance. The ringleaders were given up and put to death. The revolt of the Rhine legions was a more serious danger. In Pannonia there was no question of setting up a rival emperor, but this danger existed on the Rhine. Germanicus Caesar, governor of Gaul and general of the 8 legions stationed on the German frontier, was marked out as the successor of Tiberius, his adoptive father, and the troops of Lower Germany conceived the design of hastening his reign. They not only demanded shorter service, higher pay, and lighter labour, but proclaimed their intention of carrying Germanicus to Rome and making him emperor. Germanicus was at the time absent in Lugudunum, occupied with the census of Gaul. Aulus Caecina, an experienced officer, was in command of the legions of the Lower Province, while Upper Germany had been assigned to C. Silius. When the news reached Germanicus, he hastened to the camp on the Lower Rhine, which lay in the land of the Ubii, and appeared in the presence of the mutineers. An exciting scene then took place, the soldiers beseeching their popular commander to right their wrongs, showing him the marks of their wounds and stripes, finally urging him to march to Rome and seize the sovereign power. Germanicus expostulating and praising the virtues of Tiberius. The excitement reached such a pitch that it was necessary to withdraw the general from the presence of the troops. It was a critical moment. The mutineers talked of destroying the town of the Ubii, Oppidum Obiorum, and plundering the cities of Gaul. The German foes beyond the Rhine would not fail to take advantage speedily of the broken discipline of the army. To restore order, Germanicus was forced to concede, in the name of Tiberius, the demands of the troops. He promised that the terms of service should be shortened and that large donatives should be distributed. The legions then returned to their winter quarters, 2 under Germanicus to Oppidum Obiorum, the other 2 under the legatus Aulus Caecina to Castra Vetra. But at this moment messengers arrived from Rome for the purpose of investigating the causes of the discontent, and when the soldiers saw that the concessions might fail to be ratified, the mutiny broke out more furiously than ever. Germanicus decided that his wife and children should leave the camp. It does not appear that he apprehended any serious danger on their account, for no measures were taken to conceal their flight. They departed in broad daylight, and in view of the whole camp. The sight of Agrippina carrying in her arms the little boy Gaius, who had been born and reared in the camp, and whom they had nicknamed Caligula, boots, from the Caligulae or military boots which they made him wear in sport, moved their hearts to remorse. The memory of her father Agrippa, her grandfather Augustus, her father-in-law Drusus, stirred their pride, and when they learned that her destination was the city of the Treveri, jealousy prompted them to make peace with their general. Germanicus seized on the propitious moment to work on their softened feelings, and recalled them to their duty. They fell on their knees before him, begged for forgiveness, and zealously delivered their ringleaders to punishment. It seems likely that this scene was expressly devised by Germanicus as a last resource for appealing to the nobler sentiments of the insurgents. Thus was the danger averted in the Euboean camp. In Castra Vetra, the skilful management of the experienced Caecina restored discipline, while at Mogontiacum the agitators who tried to stir to rebellion the army of the upper province seemed to have totally failed. The only peril which threatened the succession of Tiberius was thus hindered, and for this he had to thank the unshaken fidelity of his nephew. Germanicus had refused to listen when the troops tempted him to disloyalty. He declined to take the flood of the tide which might have led him to fortune. If he had marched to Rome at the head of the Germanic legions, he would have plunged the state once more in civil war. But it is not certain that he would have been the survivor. Germanicus was a man of considerable ability, and his affable manners and urbanity won him friends everywhere. In the camp he associated freely with the soldiers, and they idolized him. He had his father's gift of making himself popular, but he had not his father's genius. It was his dream, however, to restore the work which Drusus had so brilliantly begun, and carry the eagles of Rome once more to the Albis. Immediately after the suppression of the mutiny, the young Caesar decided to employ the discontented legions, who were themselves anxious for active service. Hostilities against the Germans had been slumbering for the past few years, but no treaty had been made since the defeat of Varus, so that in making a sudden incursion the Romans were formally justified. It had been questioned whether Germanicus was not exceeding his powers in taking the offence without the express permission of the emperor. But as he had been entrusted by Augustus with his large command for the purpose of conducting the war and defending the frontier against the Germans, it must clearly have been left to his discretion when he might advance and when he should retire. In the late autumn, 14 A.D., the legions and cohorts of the lower province crossed the Rhine, cut their way through the Silva Sesia, and through the rampart which Tiberius had constructed after the Varian disaster as the limes of Roman territory. Thus they reached the land of the Marsi, who dwelt between the rivers which are now called Lippi and Ruhr. Caecina advanced in front, with some light cohorts, to reconnoitre and clear the way. It was discovered that the Marsi were to spend the night in solemn festivities, and when the Romans approached their villages after sunset, the inhabitants, unsuspicious and inebriated, offered an easy prey. The legions were divided into 4 wedges cunei, which devastated the country for 50 miles with fire and sword, sparing neither sex nor age. The holy places of the Marsi, especially the sacred precinct of the deity Tamphana, were levelled with the ground. The fate of the Marsi roused to arms neighbouring tribes, the Bructeri, who lived northward, the Tubantes, who dwelt on the Ruhr, and the Usipetes, between the Loppia and the Manus. They stationed themselves in the woods through which the Romans had to return, but the zeal of the legions and the skill of the commander shook off the enemy, and the winter quarters were safely reached. The revolt on the Lower Rhine had caused serious anxiety at Rome, and especially to Tiberius, coming as it did in conjunction with the mutiny in Pannonia. The Pannonic army was nearer Italy. On the other hand, the Germanic army was far larger, and the emperor, uncertain in which of the camps his presence was more needful, and afraid of giving the preference to either, ended by remaining in Rome and watching the issue of events. The news that Germanicus had quelled the mutiny was a great relief, but it was suspected that the military success which he gained in his brief campaign was not so agreeable to Tiberius. If so, the emperor dissembled his jealousy, praised the achievement of his nephew in the presence of the Senate, and granted him the honour of a triumph. The following year was marked by 2 distinct invasions of Germany, which, however, hung closely together and were parts of a common design. Of all the German tribes, the Cherusci, the tribe of Arminius, was the most formidable and the most hostile. They had been the leaders in the fight for freedom, which ended in the Varian disaster. Against them, above all others, policy and revenge excited the spirit of Germanicus. His plan was to prevent the neighbouring peoples from assisting them, and then attack them alone. Their most powerful neighbours were the Chatti, and the first expedition was directed against them. 1. In the spring the 4 legions of the Lower Rhine crossed the river from Castra Vetra, under the command of Caecina, who was to prevent the tribes in that quarter, especially the Marsi and the Cherusci, from marching to aid the Chatti. Caecina's army was augmented by bands of the Cis-Rhenine German tribes, Batavians, Eubii, Sugambri. Meanwhile, Germanicus himself, at the head of the 4 legions of the Upper Rhine, advanced into the territory of Mount Taunus, and attacked the Chatti so suddenly that no serious resistance could be made. Their fortress Matium was destroyed. By this means the Chatti were prevented from making common cause with the Cherusci. That people was distracted at this time by domestic discords. Segestes was invoking the help of the Romans against his enemy and son-in-law Arminius, the hero of the Teutoburg forest. The messengers of Segestes reached Germanicus as he was returning to the Rhine, and besought him to relieve their master, who was blockaded by his enemies. The Roman army retraced their steps, entered the borders of the Cherusci, and delivered their ally, who was able in return to restore some of the spoils of Pharis and hand over some important hostages, among these his daughter Thuzelda, the wife of Arminius. That warrior, infuriated at the capture of his wife, left nothing undone to stir up the passions of his nation, and he succeeded in winning over Inguomer, an influential noble who had hitherto sided with the Romans. 2. Germanicus and Caecina, who had signally defeated the Marsi, having returned to the Rhine, prepared for a grand expedition against the enemy, conceived on the same plan which Drusus had formerly adopted with success. The army was divided in 3 parts. Caecina led his legions through the land of the Bructeri to the banks of the upper Armisia. Germanicus and the 4 legions of the upper province embarked to coast along the shore of the North Sea and enter the river at its mouth, while the cavalry under Peter Albinovanus, the poet, marched to the same goal through the land of the Frisi. Successfully united, the combined army laid waste far and wide the land between the Armisia and the Lypia. Here they were near the Saltus Teutoburgiensis, where the remains of Varus and his legions lay unburied, and Germanicus could not resist the desire of visiting the spot, erecting a mound over the white bones, and honouring with funeral rites the slaughtered Romans. The lonely and melancholy scene produced a deep impression on the legions, but they were soon required to extricate themselves from a trap similar to that which had ensnared the Varian army. Arminius had hidden his forces in the forest, and the Romans had not secured themselves sufficiently against surprise. But Germanicus and Caecina were more skilful than Varus, and though he did not defeat the enemy, he retreated to Armisia with some difficulty. The return to the Rhine was not easy. The cavalry of Pedo reached their quarters without mischance, but the country through which the way of Caecina lay was heavy and marshy, and the Germans of Arminius and Inguima sought to surround him as they had surrounded Varus. The experienced Caecina was cool and collected in these perils, and knew how to maintain discipline, but he might have failed to extricate his army but for a false move of the foe. The Germans had made a successful attack on the cavalry and baggage of the Romans, and, elated by their luck, proceeded, contrary to the counsels of Arminius, to assault the Roman camp. Waiting until they had reached the rampart, Caecina suddenly threw open the gates and poured out his troops on the besiegers. The Germans suffered a decisive defeat. Inguima was severely wounded, and the Romans were able to proceed on their way. A false rumour of their destruction had gone before them to Castra Vetra, and it was proposed there to break down the Rhine bridge, but the humanity and courage of Agrippina saved the means of retreat for the fugitive army. She stood at the head of the bridge and would not move until the remnant should reach it, and she was repaid by seeing the arrival of the 4 legions safe and whole. The return of Germanicus himself was attended with ill luck and serious losses. He found it necessary to lighten his ships amid the shallow waters of the Phrygian coast, and disembarked 2 legions, directing them to march along the shore. The treacherous equinoctial tides swept away a large number of the soldiers and much of their baggage. On the whole, the campaign could hardly be regarded as a success. The dangers and losses of the return march threw a cloud over the expedition, and Tiberius had some reason to murmur at the little results obtained at such expense. The advantages won by Germanicus were only momentary, for he had done nothing to effect a permanent occupation of the country which he had laid waste. He had built no fort, and established no lines of communication. His wisdom in visiting the battlefield of Varus was open to question. Tiberius, naturally distrustful, nourished some jealousy and perhaps fear of his popular nephew, and there were enemies of Germanicus at Rome who were eager to encourage such feelings. But the emperor had not yet decided to interfere with the plans of Germanicus for the subjugation of Germany, and he professed to regard the achievements of the year as worthy of a triumph. He seems not to have fully made up his mind yet whether the conquest of Germany was really desirable or its permanent occupation possible. The next and last campaign of Germanicus, 16 A.D., was planned on a larger scale. This time he hoped to reach the Albis and break the last resistance of the Cherusci. A fleet of 1,000 ships was collected, where the Rhine broadens and branches into the Vahalis, and the whole army embarked and sailed down the Fossa Drusiana, where Germanicus invoked the spirit and recalled the memory of his father. Before starting, he had taken the precaution to send his legatus, C. Silius, to make a demonstration against the Catti, and had himself, with 6 legions, marched up the valley of Lupia, to secure strongholds and make provisions for the return of his army. The fleet reached the mouth of Amysia safely, and, leaving the ships anchored and guarded, the Romans advanced in a south-eastern direction to the banks of the Visurgis, where the Germans, prepared for their coming, had concentrated their forces under the leadership of the indefatigable Arminius. Here, at length, the Roman invader and the champion of German freedom were to fairly try their strength in a field of battle. The reserved historian Tacitus rises to the occasion as he describes the campaign which decided both the destinies of Germany and the fortunes of his hero Germanicus. He embellishes his Germaniad with tales which have a ring of legend and throw over the young general a halo of romance which his deeds hardly deserved. The colloquy of Arminius and his renegade brother Flavius, standing on the opposite banks of the Visurgis, is, if not true, well imagined. Flavius had lost an eye in the service of the Romans, and Arminius, when he had inquired and learned the cause of the disfigurement, asked, "What was thy reward?" "I received," said Flavius, "increase of pay, a gold chain and crown, and other military distinctions." "Vile badges of slavery," sneered his brother. Flavius continued to praise the greatness of Rome and the emperor, while Arminius appealed to ancestral freedom and the national gods of Germany. At length such bitter words were bandied, and the wrath of the brothers rose so high that they were about to plunge into the stream and grip each other in mortal struggle. But the Romans intervened and dragged Flavius from the bank. The night adventure of Germanicus has the same epic flavour as the converse of the German brethren. The Romans crossed the Visurgis in the face of the enemy, who had retreated into the recesses of a sacred wood, and news was brought that Arminius contemplated a night attack on the Roman camp. Tacitus tells us how Germanicus, like our own Henry V, was seized with the desire to ascertain the spirit of his soldiers, and how for this purpose he disguised himself, and with the skin over his shoulders, attended by one companion, he went round to camp and listened to near the tents. He was pleased to hear his own praises loudly sung, and to observe that the men were eager to punish the perfidious foe. As he traversed the camp, a German horseman rode up to the rampart, and in the Latin tongue invited deserters in the name of Arminius, with promises of lands, wives, and a daily sum of money. Scornful was the answer, "Let the day break, let battle begin, we will ourselves seize your wives and lands." The battle was fought in the plain of Edistaviso, which probably lies to the south of the Porta Westphalica on the right bank of the Visurgis. The Germans had occupied the lower slopes of the mountains, and were protected in the rear by wood, unencumbered with brushwood, and thus offering an easy retreat. The Cherusci placed themselves on the higher hills, intending to rush down upon the Romans in the midst of the battle. While the legions and auxiliaries advanced to attack the German position in the open plain, Germanicus sent a body of cavalry round to outflank the enemy and fall on their rear. This movement was completely successful. The German forces, which were stationed in the wood, were driven out of their cover into the plain, while at the same time the ranks which were drawn up in the plain were beaten back before the onset of the legions into the wood. The confusion was increased by the Cherusci, who were forced by the attack of the cavalry to descend from the hills into the midst of the battle. Arminius essayed bravely to sustain the fight, but he and his fellows were surrounded by the Roman forces, and their doom seemed sealed. Arminius, however, and Inguiomer managed to escape, perhaps owing to the treachery of some German auxiliaries. The rest were slain. This decisive victory was gained by the Romans without any serious loss. The soldiers saluted Tiberius as Imperator, and erected the trophy of the arms of the enemy, subscribing the names of the conquered nations. The defeated and dejected Germans were, it is said, preparing to cross the Albis and leave their country to the victor, but this trophy excited their rage and decided them to make another desperate attempt. It may be suspected, however, that the battle of Idis-Sarezzo was less decisive than it has been represented. In any case, the enemy once more collected large forces and occupied a place protected by woods and a deep swamp, and on one side by an old rampart. But Germanicus discovered their position and did not fall into the trap. He attacked them on the side of the earthwork, and forced his way into the small space in which they were thickly packed together. Their position was desperate. If they retreated, they must perish in the march, and with their long swords they could sustain no equal combat with the legions at such close quarters. Germanicus, it is said, was in the thickest of the fray, crying that the Germans must be exterminated, but the barbarians fought it well. Arminius escaped, and the cavalry engagement was indecisive. At nightfall the Romans returned to their camp, victorious indeed, but without having exterminated or routed the foe. The angry Varii were the only tribe who sued for peace. Germanicus erected a second trophy, which told how the army of Tiberius Caesar, having subdued all the nations between the Rhine and the Albis, dedicated this monument to Mars and Jupiter and Augustus. It was now the middle of summer, and Germanicus, notwithstanding his successes, resolved to retrace his steps. Some of the legions returned by land, others by sea on the ships which awaited them at the mouth of the Amisia. The voyage was disastrous, owing to the violent gales which agitate the North Sea in the autumn season. The fleet was scattered, and Germanicus himself wrecked on the shore of the Corsi. The losses, however, were not so great as was at first thought, and on his return to the Rhine, some successes gained against the Marsi and the Catti partly restored the spirit of the troops, which the sea disaster had damped, and the last of the captured eagles of Varus were recovered. Germanicus deemed that he was now near the goal of his ambition. One more campaign would suffice, he thought, for the complete subjugation of Germany. But destiny decreed, and Tiberius judged, otherwise. It is clear enough that the victories of the last campaign were far less important and complete than Tacitus has tried to make them out. Their results were only temporary, and the emperor, perhaps wisely, decided that no abiding result was likely to be achieved by Germanicus. There was indeed reason for disappointment. Nothing had been accomplished in proportion to the magnitude of the expeditions. Accordingly Tiberius offered the consulship to his nephew, and this was equivalent to a recall. How far the sovereign was influenced by a lurking jealousy of the popular general, how far he deemed it inexpedient that a close connection between Germanicus and the Rhine army should continue, we cannot say, but it is only fair to point out that the recall of Germanicus can be completely explained by political considerations without taking into account any personal motives. Tiberius may have come to the conclusion that annual invasions of Germany were too slow and costly a method of winning the new province, even though it was certain that this method must ultimately succeed. A different policy was suggested by the intestine feuds of the barbarians. If the Romans retired from the field, a deadly contest must soon take place between the Saxon and the Suevian tribes, and when the enemy had enfeebled themselves in domestic war, the Romans might step in and take possession of their country. This was a plausible policy, and was perhaps seriously entertained by Tiberius. But it is possible that he had really come to regard the advance to the Albis as a visionary idea which it would not be expedient to realize. If the Rhine troops changed their station to the banks of the Albis, would not another army be required to watch Gaul, and would the state be able to support another army? These were the questions which a statesman had to consider, and they may have decided Tiberius, as they seem to have decided Augustus, that the Rhine was roughly the limit. In any case, Financial considerations had probably much to do with the disappointment of the dreams of Germanicus. From the year 17 A.D. forward, we never find one man uniting under his single authority both the government of the Gallic provinces and the command of the Germanic armies. Henceforward, the 3 provinces of Gaul are administered by 3 praetorian governors, and the 2 frontier districts, Upper and Lower Germany, are kept strictly separate under 2 consular legati, who are always, up to the time of Hadrian, strictly military commanders, legati exercitus inferioris et superioris, not legati provinciae, though often loosely spoken of as such. The financial administration of these military districts was at first combined with that of Belgica, like that of Numidia with Africa. It is to be observed that for many years yet the province of Lower Germany extended beyond the Rhine and as far as the Lower Amisia. The young general celebrated a brilliant triumph, 26th of May, 17 A.D., over the conquered nations between the Rhine and Elbis. Thusnelda, the wife of Arminius, with her infant son Thesmalicus, whom she had borne in captivity, was among the captives who adorned the procession. It is said that in the midst of the festivities people felt a gloomy presentiment, comparing the young Caesar with his father Drusus and his uncle Marcellus, who like him had been so popular but had died so early. Brave and unlucky, they said, have been the loves of the Roman people. After his triumph, Germanicus was appointed to an honourable mission in the East. At the same time his cousin Drusus was sent to Illyricum to observe the course of affairs in northern Europe. Arminius and his Cherusci, with their Saxon federates, having no longer to oppose the invasions of the Romans, hastened to deal with the Suevian state in the south, over which Maroboduus held sway with the title of king. It will be remembered that this chief had refused to join Arminius after the defeat of Varus. He was an admirer of Roman civilization, having spent part of his youth in Rome, and he tried to introduce Roman manners and government among his countrymen. Throughout this struggle for freedom he had remained persistently neutral. The centre of his power and his palace lay in Boiohaemon, but he was recognized as the head of a large and loose Suevic confederacy. Of these tribes, the Semnones and Langobardi deserted his cause on the first attack of the Cherusci. On the other hand, the Cheruscan Inguiomer went over to Maroboduus. A decisive battle was fought, in which the Suevians were defeated, and many more of his allies deserted the Suevic king, who then applied for aid to the Roman emperor. Tiberius immediately sent Drusus to confirm peace, perhaps really to effect the downfall of Maroboduus. The unlucky king was finally overthrown and driven from his realm by Catuelda, chief of the Catones, a people who lived on the lower Vistula. They invaded the land of the Marcomanni, and stormed the town and stronghold of Maroboduus, who was forced to flee to the refuge of the empire and throw himself on the emperor's mercy. Ravenna was assigned to him as a dwelling place, where Thusnelda and her son had been also doomed to live. It was a curious historical coincidence that the city of the marshes, which was destined 5 centuries later to be the capital of the great German hero, the Ostrogothic King Theodoric, should have been selected as the habitation of Maroboduus, his predecessor in attempting to spread Roman ideas among his countrymen. Maroboduus lived 18 years at Ravenna, vainly expecting to be restored to power. He had the satisfaction to see Catuelda overthrown, and like himself seeking a refuge from the Romans. He had the satisfaction to see his younger rival Arminius succumb to the guile of a domestic enemy, 21 A.D. After the defeat of the Suevians, the hero of Germany had been false himself to the freedom for which he had fought, and tried to establish a monarchical power. He was undoubtedly, says the Roman historian, the deliverer of Germany, and not one of those who attacked the Roman people in the beginning of its power, but when it was at the height of its prosperity. He lost battles, but in war he was unconquered. He died at the age of 37 in the 12th year of his power, and he is still sung among the barbarians, although to the annals of the Greeks he is unknown, and among the Romans not as celebrated as he deserves. End of Chapter 12, Section 1-2.
Sections 3 and 4 of Tiberius, The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalinda. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnall Bury. Chapter 12, Section 3-4. Section 3. Germanicus in the East. His death and the trial of Piso. In the East several affairs demanded the attention of the government, but not so imperatively as to require an extraordinary command like that which Tiberius assigned to Germanicus after his triumph. The dependent principalities of Cappadocia, Commagene, and Cilicia Aspera had to be transformed into provinces. For Archelaus of Cappadocia had been recalled to Rome, and informed that he had ceased to reign, while the peoples of Commagene and Cilicia had, on the death of their princes, begged for a direct Roman government. The inhabitants of Judea and Syria were murmuring loudly at the heavy taxation, and demanding a reduction. New difficulties had also arisen with the Parthian kingdom. Vonones, son of Phraates IV., who had been kept by Augustus as a hostage and brought up at Rome, was elected to the throne by the Parthians after the death of their king. He did not, however, reign long. His Roman manners gave offence, and he was forced to surrender his throne to Artabanus of Media, and fly to Seleucia. The Armenian throne was at this moment vacant, and the people accepted the fugitive Vonones as their sovran, but Artabanus, who could not endure the rule of his rival in a neighbouring kingdom, called upon them to surrender him. Meanwhile Silanus, legatus of Syria, got possession of the person of Vonones, and detained him in Syria. All these affairs might have been arranged by ordinary imperial legati, but Tiberius may have had a good reason for sending a near kinsman and a Caesar, invested with special powers and representing the imperial majesty, to deal with the eastern countries, where pomp always produces its effect. Such a plan had been successful before, when Gaius Caesar received a like mission from Augustus. The sphere of the command of Germanicus was all the provinces beyond the Hellespont. He travelled thither at leisurely speed, visiting Nicopolis, Athens, and Lesbos on his way, and lingering in the cities of the Hellespont. The affairs of Armenia he arranged without difficulty, and established friendly relations with the Parthian king. The favour of the Armenians inclined to Zeno, son of Polemo, former king of Pontus, who had been brought up as an Armenian from his infancy, and was popular by his excellence as a huntsman and a trencherman. Germanicus visited the city of Artaxaea, and solemnly crowned Zeno there under the royal name of Artaxes. This arrangement also satisfied Artabanus, who regarded Vonones as the Roman candidate, and had put forward his own son Orodes as the Parthian candidate. The election of Artaxes was a satisfactory compromise, and Artabanus sent a courteous message to the Roman general, proposing a personal meeting on the Euphrates, and only requiring him to remove Vonones from Syria so as to prevent communications with the disaffected party in Persia. Germanicus readily acceded to the request, and Vonones was removed to Pompeiiopolis in Cilicia. Thus excellent relations were established between the Roman and the Parthian powers, and continued to exist during the lifetime of Artaxes, until the last years of the reign of Tiberius. Cappadocia and Commagene were at the same time incorporated in the provincial system, and thus the direct rule of Rome extended now to the Euphrates. Germanicus had speedily and satisfactorily accomplished the main object of his mission, but he had other difficulties to contend with. It was not the intention of Tiberius that the ample authority of the young Caesar should be as completely unchecked in the east as it had been in the north. Consequently Silanus, who was a personal friend of Germanicus, was replaced as proconsul of Syria by Cn. Calpurnius Piso, a proud, self-asserting nobleman, who would not hesitate to hold his own against his superior. The position of Piso was strengthened, and his independent spirit encouraged by the bonds of intimacy which existed between his wife Plancina and the Emperor's mother Livia. The dissensions of Piso and Germanicus were doubtless embittered by the rivalry of Plancina and Agrippina. Piso had been instructed to lead or send a portion of the Syrian army to join Germanicus in Armenia. He disobeyed this command, and the ill feeling between the Caesar and the legatus became very bitter. It is not clear why Germanicus did not invoke the intervention of the Emperor, but instead of asserting his authority in Syria he made an excursion to Egypt, not for any political purpose, but from a curiosity to visit the antiquities of the land. This expedition was imprudent in two ways, for it left the field clear to Piso, and it violated the law of Augustus, that no senator should set foot on Egyptian soil without the express permission of the Emperor. On returning to Syria, Germanicus found that Piso had disregarded and overthrown his own regulations. This discovery roused him into asserting his authority, and Piso prepared to leave the province. Suddenly Germanicus fell ill at Antioch, and Piso postponed his departure. The attendants of Germanicus suspected and circulated their suspicions that poison had been administered to him by Piso or his wife. Messages inquiring after the health of the prince arrived from Piso, who was lingering at Seleucia, but Germanicus, distrustful of their genuineness, wrote a letter to the governor, renouncing his friendship, and commanding him, perhaps, to leave the province. Piso sailed to Cos, and there received the news of his rival's death (19 A.D.). Germanicus himself believed that he was the victim of foul play, for on his deathbed he charged his friends to prosecute Piso and Plancina, and his friends determined that he should be avenged. Agrippina, with her children and the ashes of her husband, immediately set sail for Rome. The staff of the dead prince chose C. Sentius Saturninus to take charge of Syria until a new governor should be appointed. Piso, however, determined to make a bold attempt to resume his command in that province, and for this purpose collected some troops in Cilicia. But Sentius was victorious in an engagement, and besieged Piso in the Cilician fortress of Celenderis. The ex-governor was finally forced to submit, and take ship for Rome, where an unpleasant reception awaited him. The feelings of sympathy awakened by the death of Germanicus were intense, both in the provinces and at Rome. Triumphal arches were erected in his honour, and his statues were set up in cities. Inscriptions recorded that he had died for the Republic. Correspondingly bitter was the rage felt against Piso and Plancina, who were generally believed to have been guilty. Nor were there wanting hints and murmurs that Tiberius himself and Livia were privy to the supposed crime of Piso and Plancina. It was thought that Tiberius regarded his nephew with jealousy and hatred, and rejoiced at his death, and it was apparently this idea that encouraged Piso to act as he had done. The reserve of Tiberius in regard to the funeral ceremonies of Germanicus, at which he and Livia were not present, was interpreted in the same way, and the Emperor even went so far as to show displeasure at the excess of the public lamentations. He issued a characteristic edict, enjoining on the people to observe some moderation in their sorrow. "Princes are mortal, the Republic is eternal. Resume your business, resume your pleasures," he added, for the Megalesian games approached. By this contempt for popular sentiment, Tiberius, it has been remarked, was sowing the seeds of a long and deep misunderstanding between himself and his people. Men contrasted the behaviour of Augustus on the death of Drusus. But the Emperor had no intention of protecting Piso, who had been guilty of the serious offence of trying to recover a province from which he had been dismissed by a superior in authority. The friends of Germanicus vied in undertaking the prosecution, but it was hard to find advocates to plead the cause of Piso. His friends wished the accused to come before the tribunal of the Emperor, but Tiberius did not like to undertake the decision of such a delicate case, and he referred the judgment of it to the senate. He opened the proceedings in the senate house in a very impartial speech. The charges of political misconduct were clearly proven, but the charge of having made attempts on the life of Germanicus by magic and poison broke down. The senators, however, who in general sympathised with Germanicus, felt convinced that the prince's death had been due to foul play, while the political offences of the culprit weighed with Tiberius. At the close of the second day of the trial, Piso saw in the cold look of the Emperor that his doom was fixed. His conclusion was confirmed by the behaviour of his wife Plancina, who had pleaded for him with the Empress Livia, but, as his chance of escape seemed to grow less, tried to sever her own cause from his. He anticipated the sentence by piercing his throat with his sword. The senate expunged his name from the Fasti and banished his eldest son for 10 years, but Tiberius interfered to mitigate the sentence of the senate, and conceded Piso's property to his son. The influence of Livia shielded Plancina from prosecution. Thus ended a domestic tragedy. It must be observed that even if it were certain that Germanicus was the victim of foul play, there is not the smallest reason to suspect that the Emperor was in any way concerned, as malicious rumours hinted. But there is no proof, and there can be no certainty that the death of Germanicus was brought about by unfair practices of Piso or his wife. Another malicious report which gained belief was that Piso had not died by his own hand, but had been assassinated by the orders of the Emperor. The qualities of Germanicus have been painted in such bright colours by the great Roman historian who has recorded his career, that we cannot help feeling deeply prepossessed in his favour. He appears as one of the ideal heroes who die young. But it is not clear that he would have become a great man if he had lived. His exploits have been exaggerated by the enthusiasm of his admirers. Tacitus, with more regard to art than truth, has selected him as the brilliant hero to set beside the dark figure of Tiberius. Germanicus is generous and virtuous, Tiberius suspicious and stained with crime. The uncle is the ideal tyrant, the nephew is the magnanimous prince. This picture of Tacitus in some measure reflects the general feeling which seems to have prevailed on the death of the popular Germanicus. Tiberius was misunderstood and maligned; the virtues of the son of Drusus were exaggerated. In the year 16 A.D. a plot was detected, which, though not of a formidable nature, attracted considerable attention. It shows that there was dissatisfaction in patrician circles, and illustrates the character of Tiberius. A young man named Libo Drusus, of the Scribonian family, was accused of revolutionary projects. Scribonia, the second wife of Augustus, was his great aunt, Livia was his aunt, and he was the grandson of Sextus Pompeius through his mother. These connections with the imperial house seem to have turned his brain and suggested perilous ideas, which were encouraged by a senator named Firmius Catus, who was his intimate friend. Catus induced him to consult Chaldaean astrologers and dabble in magic rites, practices which were then very dangerous, as they were regarded as a presumption of treasonable designs. He also treacherously led Drusus into extravagance and debt. Having collected sufficient proofs of guilt, Catus sent a messenger to the Emperor, craving an audience and mentioning the name of the accused. Tiberius refused the request, saying that any further communications might be conveyed to him in the same way. Meanwhile he distinguished his cousin Libo by conferring the praetorship on him, and often inviting him to table, showing no unfriendliness either in word or look, but he kept himself carefully informed of the daily conduct of the suspected man. At length a certain Junius, whom Libo had tampered with for the purpose of invoking the dead by incantations, gave information to a noted informer, Fulcinius Trio, who immediately went to the consuls and demanded an investigation before the senate. Libo, meanwhile knowing his peril, arrayed himself in mourning, and, accompanied by some ladies of high rank, went round the houses of his relatives entreating their intervention. But all refused on various pretexts. When the senate met, Tiberius read out the indictment and the accusers' names with such calmness as to seem neither to soften nor to aggravate the charges. Some of them were of a ridiculous nature. For example, he was accused of having considered whether he would ever have wealth enough to cover the Appian road as far as Brundusium with money. But there was one paper in which the names of Caesars and senators occurred with mysterious, and therefore suspicious, signs annexed. Libo denied the handwriting, and the slaves who professed to recognize it were examined by torture. As an old decree of the senate forbade the evidence of slaves to be taken in cases affecting their master's life, Tiberius evaded the law by ordering the slaves to be sold singly to the actor publicus, or agent of the aerarium, so that Libo might be tried on their testimony. The accused begged for an adjournment till the following day. On going home he committed suicide, seeing that his case was hopeless. Tiberius said that he would have interceded for him, guilty though he was, if he had not destroyed himself. Libo's property was divided among the accusers, and some of the senators proposed decrees reflecting on his memory; for example, that no Scribonian should bear the name of Drusus, in order to please Tiberius. Days of public thanksgiving were appointed, and it was decreed that the day on which Libo killed himself should be observed as a festival. Such sycophancy on the part of the senate became in later times a matter of course. SECT. IV. — REBELLIONS IN THE PROVINCES AND DEPENDENCIES. We must glance at the troublesome, though unimportant war, which was waged at this time on the southern borders of the Empire, and at the career of Tacfarinas, who played in Africa the same part which the more famous Arminius played in the north. This Numidian had served in the Roman army, and had thus gained a knowledge of Roman discipline and military science. He then deserted, placed himself at the head of a band of robbers, and was finally elected as their leader by the Musulamni, who dwelt on the southern side of Mount Aurasius. The insurrection was not confined to these peoples of Numidia. It spread westward into Mauretania and eastward to the Garamantes. The discipline and drill which Tacfarinas enforced rendered the rising formidable, for his organised bands were able to give battle and attempt sieges. The commanders, whom the senate elected by lot, were incompetent to deal with the insurgents, and the resulting war was protracted for 7 years (17 to 24 A.D.). The single legion which protected Africa was reinforced by a second from Pannonia, and by the Emperor's intervention an able proconsul, Q. Junius Blsesus, was at length appointed. Tacfarinas had demanded from Tiberius a grant of territory for himself and his rebel army. Tiberius haughtily refused, and instructed Blsesus to hold out to other chiefs who supported Tacfarinas the prospect of a free pardon if they laid down their arms. Many surrendered, and then Blsesus attempted to meet Tacfarinas by tactics similar to his own. He divided his army into 3 columns, one of which he dispatched eastward under Cornelius Scipio to act against the Garamantes and protect Leptis. In the west the son of Blsesus commanded a second column and defended the territory of Cirta, while in the centre Blsesus himself established a number of fortified positions, and thus embarrassed the enemy, who found wherever he turned Roman soldiers in his face or on his flank or in his rear. When summer was over, Blsesus continued hostilities, and by a skilful combination of forts and flying detachments of picked men, who were acquainted with the desert, he drove Tacfarinas back step by step, and finally captured his brother and occupied the district of the Musulamni (22 A.D.). Tiberius permitted the triumphal ornaments to be awarded to Blsesus, and also granted him the distinction of being greeted Imperator by the troops, the last occasion on which this honour was granted to a private person. But even the success of Blsesus was not the end of the insurrection. There were 3 laurelled statues at Rome for victories over the Musulamian chief, those of Camillus, Apronius, and Blsesus, and yet he was still ravaging Africa, supported on the one hand by the king of the Garamantes, on the other by the Moors. His boldness was increased by the circumstance that, after the campaign of Blsesus, the 9th legion had been recalled from Africa. In 24 A.D. he laid siege to Thubursicum, a Numidian town lying a little to the north of Mount Aurasius. The proconsul of the year, Publius Dolabella, immediately collected all his troops and raised the siege. Knowing by the experience of previous campaigns that it was useless to concentrate his heavy troops against an enemy which practised such desultory warfare as Tacfarinas, Dolabella adopted the plan of Blsesus, and divided his forces into 4 columns. He also obtained reinforcements from Ptolemy, king of the Mauretanians. Presently he was informed that the Numidian marauders had taken up a position close to Ozea (Aumale), a dilapidated fort, surrounded by vast forests. Some light armed infantry and squadrons of horse were immediately hurried to the place, without being told whither they were going. At daybreak they fell upon the drowsy barbarians, who had no means of flight, as their horses were tethered or pasturing at a distance. The dispositions of the Romans were so complete that the enemies were slaughtered or captured without difficulty. The general was anxious to capture Tacfarinas, but that chieftain, driven to bay, escaped captivity by rushing on the weapons of his assailants. His death ended this tedious war. During this period there were also grave disturbances in Gaul and Thrace. In Gaul the fiscal exactions had led to heavy accumulations of debt among the provincials, and the creditors pressed for payment. The provincials resorted to counsels of despair. A conspiracy was formed to organize a rebellion throughout the whole land and throw off the Roman yoke. The leaders were Julius Florus and Julius Sacrovir, 2 Romanised provincials. Florus undertook to gain over the Belgae and Treveri, while Sacrovir, who perhaps held some priestly office, intrigued among the Aedui and other tribes. The secret was well kept, and the revolt broke out in western Gaul in the consulship of Tiberius and Drusus (21 A.D.). But the first rising was premature. The Andecavi and the Turones, whose names still live in Anjou and Tours, moved too soon, and were crushed by the garrison of Lugudunum under Acilius Aviola, the legatus of Lugudunensis. This false move put the Romans on their guard, and the subsequent risings of the Treveri were easily foiled by the governors of the two Germanic provinces. Florus slew himself to escape capture. The Aedui had seized the important city of Augustodunum (Autun), but they too were easily defeated by C. Silius, legatus of Upper Germany, at the 12th milestone from that town. Sacrovir escaped from the field to a neighbouring villa, where he fell by his own hand, and his faithful comrades slew one another, having first set fire to the house. A triumphal arch was erected at Orazio (Orange) to commemorate the defeat of Sacrovir. The dependent kingdom of Thrace, after the death of Rhœmetalces, who had loyally stood by the Romans in the Dalmatian revolt, was divided between his brother Rhascuporis and his son Cotys. Their jealousies and feuds, which ended in the murder of Cotys, led to Roman interference and the execution of his uncle (19 A.D.). 2 years later a formidable insurrection of the western tribes broke out. The rebels besieged Philippopolis, but were defeated by P. Velleius, the governor of Moesia. They rebelled again in 25 A.D., and of this rising we have more details. The mountaineers refused to submit to levies and to supply their bravest men to the armies of Rome. A rumour had spread that they were to be dragged from their own land to distant provinces, so that, mixed with other nations, they might lose their own nationality. They sent envoys to the governor of Achaia and Macedonia, Papias Sabinus, assuring him of their fidelity, if no fresh burden were laid upon them. Otherwise they gave him to understand that they would fight for their freedom. He gave mild answers until he had completed his preparations, but when he had concentrated his forces and was joined by a legion from Moesia and reinforcements from Rhœmetalces, son of Rhascuporis, he advanced on the rebels, who had taken up a position in some wooded defiles in the mountains, in the neighbourhood of a strong fortress. Sabinus fortified a camp and occupied with a strong detachment a long narrow mountain ridge which stretched as far as the enemy's fortress, which it was his object to capture. After some skirmishing in front of the stronghold, Sabinus moved his camp nearer, but left his Thracian allies in the former entrenchments, with strict injunctions to pass the night vigilantly within the camp, while they might harry and plunder as much as they wished in the daytime. Having observed this command for some time, they began to neglect their watches, and gave themselves up to the enjoyment of wine and sleep. Learning this, the insurgents formed two bands, of which one was to surprise the pillagers, the other to attack the Roman camp, in order to distract the attention of the soldiers. The plan was successful, and the Thracian auxiliaries were massacred. Sabinus then laid regular siege to the stronghold, and connected his positions with a ditch and a rampart. The besieged suffered terribly from thirst, and their cattle were dying for want of fodder. The air of the place was polluted with the stench of the rotting carcasses of those who had perished by wounds or thirst. In this situation many followed the advice and example of an old man named Dimmus, who surrendered himself with his wife and children to the Romans. But two young chieftains named Tarsa and Turissus had determined to die for their freedom. Tarsa plunged his sword in his heart, and a few others did likewise. But Turissus and his followers decided to prolong the struggle, and planned a night attack on the camp during a storm. Sabinus was prepared, and the brave barbarians were beaten back and compelled to surrender. The triumphal ornaments were decreed to Sabinus (26 A.D.). Against a revolt of tributaries on the northern boundary of the Empire, the arms of Rome were not so successful. The Frisians, who had been subdued by Drusus in 12 B.C., had for 40 years paid the tribute which he imposed on them. This tribute consisted in ox hides, which were required for military purposes, and the officers who levied it never examined too curiously the size or thickness of the skins, until in 28 A.D. Olennius, a primipillar centurion, who was appointed to exact the tribute, chose the hides of wild bulls as the standard. As the domestic cattle of the Germans were of small size, the Frisians found this innovation hard. In order to meet the demands of Olennius, they were forced to give up first their cattle, then their lands, finally to surrender their wives and children as pledges. As their complaints led to no redress, they rose in revolt. The soldiers who were collecting the tribute were impaled on gibbets, and Olennius himself was obliged to flee to the fortress of Flavum, probably in the island of the same name, now Vlieland, near the Texel, which was a Roman coastguard station. When the news reached L. Apronius, the governor of Lower Germany, he summoned some veteran legionaries, and chose auxiliaries from the upper province to reinforce his own legions, with which he sailed down the Rhine and relieved Flavum, which the Frisians were besieging. He then constructed roads and bridges over the adjoining estuaries, in order to transport his legionaries into the heart of the Frisian territory, and in the meantime sent some auxiliary cavalry and infantry across by a ford to take the enemy in the rear. The Frisians beat these forces back. More cohorts and squadrons were sent to the rescue, but these too were repulsed, and soon all the auxiliary forces were engaged. The legions were at length able to intervene, and just saved the cohorts and cavalry, who were completely exhausted. A large number of officers had fallen, but Apronius did not attempt to take vengeance, or even to bury the dead. Two other disasters completed the ill luck of the Romans. 900 soldiers were destroyed by the enemy in the wood of Baduhenna, and another body of 400, who had taken possession of a country house, perished by mutual slaughter, to avoid falling into the hands of the enemy. No further steps seem to have been taken against the Frisians. These events probably confirmed Tiberius in his determination to regard the Rhine as the limit of the Roman Empire, and he thought it a good opportunity to abandon the last relic of the conquests of his brother beyond that river. The reign of Tiberius was very nearly being marked by a slave war in southern Italy, but by a lucky accident the movement was crushed in its very beginning, 24 A.D. The organizer of the rebellion was Titus Curtisius, who had once been a praetorian soldier. He held secret meetings at Brundusium and other towns in the neighbourhood, then posted up placards, and incited the slave population in Calabria and Apulia to assert their liberty. 3 vessels happened to come to land just then, and from them the quaestor Curtius Lupus, who had charge of the saltus, or forests and pastures in those parts, obtained a force of marines and crushed the conspiracy. Curtisius and his chief accomplices were sent prisoners to Rome, where, says Tacitus, men already felt alarm at the enormous number of the slave population, which was ever increasing, while the freeborn population grew less every day. The great marvel is that combinations among the slaves were not more common, and that it was not thought necessary to keep considerable garrisons in the towns of Italy to meet such emergencies. End of Chapter 12, Section 4. Recording by Kalinda in Lüneburg, Germany, on March 21st, 2009.
Chapter 13, Section 1 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnall Bury. Chapter 13. The Principate of Tiberius. Continued. 14 to 37 A.D. Section 1. Civil Government of Tiberius. As the reign of Tiberius was singularly exempt from wars, the emperor was able to devote his undivided attention to domestic government and the welfare of his subjects. His policy was distinguished by a conservative spirit. The chief principle of his administration was to follow the lines marked out by his predecessor. By abandoning the practice, which Augustus had adopted, of receiving an investiture of supreme power for a limited period only, he made a step nearer undisguised monarchy. The Decennalia, or feast in honour of the decennial renewal of the tribunician power of the emperor, survived as a mere custom, without any political meaning. In 2 important matters he went beyond Augustus in emphasizing the diarchy and excluding the people from the government. 1. The functions which Augustus had left to the comitia of the people, in electing magistrates, were taken away by Tiberius, and transferred to the senate soon after his accession. The only part left to the people was to acclaim those whom the senate chose. Tiberius preserved the imperial rights of nomination and commendation of candidates within the limits marked out by his father. 2. The people did not formally lose its sovereign right of legislation, but since the time of Tiberius it actually ceased to legislate. For the Emperor and the magistrates ceased to bring leges before the comitia. There are only 2 instances of such leges in the reign of Tiberius, while there are numerous senatus consulta. The later emperors, Claudius and Nerva, temporarily revived the old practice, but with these exceptions it may be said that, from Tiberius forward, legislation consisted of the consulta of the senate and the rescripts of the emperor. The only legislative purpose for which the people had any longer to meet in comitia was to transfer the tribunician power on a new Princeps. Another important matter in which Tiberius carried further an idea originated by Augustus was the establishment of a permanent prefecture of the city of Rome. We have seen that this office had been instituted as a temporary provision for the care of the city during absences of the emperor, and Lucius Calpurnius Piso had been appointed prefect when Augustus left Rome in 14 A.D. Tiberius made the office a permanent post of great dignity, only open to senators of consular rank. He placed the 3 cohortes urbanis at the disposal of the prefect, and thus deprived the senate of the police control of the city. The prefect had a criminal court, in which he administered summary justice in the case of slaves and roughs. Piso held the office for nearly 20 years, till his death in 32 A.D. Tiberius also instituted a new official of consular rank to look after the banks of the Tiber, cura riparum et alveae Tiberis, in addition to the cura aquarum, which had been founded by Augustus. Tiberius concerned himself for the improvement of the civil service. One great defect of the prevalent system was that offices were filled by inexperienced young men, who held them for only a brief time. Tiberius tried to remedy this by extending the period of tenure, and men began to complain that they grew old in the discharge of the same duties. He did not attempt to introduce this innovation in the case of the magistrates appointed by the senate, and this was a sign that he was in earnest with the maintaining of the imperial system of Augustus, by which the senate had its sphere of activity independent of the emperor. And when the proposal came from that body, in 22 A.D., that the emperor should test the qualifications of senatorial magistrates, Tiberius rejected it. He always behaved with studied politeness to senators, and he was accustomed to refer to the senate matters which might more naturally have come before himself. Like Augustus, he employed a consilium, which consisted of his personal advisers and 20 illustrious members of the senatorial and equestrian orders, but it does not appear that this cabinet council had any real influence in political affairs. Tiberius was curiously reserved in avoiding the assertion of his sovereign power by titles and outward forms. In affecting to disguise his imperial position he went much further than Augustus. He never bore the praenomen imperator, and called himself Augustus only when he was corresponding with foreign princes. He refused the title pater patriae, and forbade all, except his slaves, to address him as Dominus. He did not permit temples or statues to be erected to himself, and he rejected the proposal to consecrate his mother, Livia Augusta. In the army he maintained strict discipline. He declined to fulfil the promises of Higher Pav, which had been made to the mutineers in Illyricum and on the Rhine after his accession, and instead of shortening the period of service, he actually lengthened it. These facts indicate the strength of his authority with the troops. He took away from victorious generals the privilege of bearing the title imperator, and reserved it for members of the imperial family. In regard to the praetorian guards, he made an innovation, which has an important bearing on the future course of Roman history. Augustus had allowed only 3 cohorts to be quartered within the city, the other 6 being dispersed in the neighbourhood of Rome. Tiberius caused a permanent camp to be built in front of the Porta Viminalis, 23 A.D., and henceforward all the 9 cohorts were stationed there together. Thus united, they were conscious of their numbers and felt their power, and at many a crisis they disposed of the empire and elected emperors. This step also increased considerably the political power of the praetorian prefect. In fact, the idea seems to have emanated from the favourite counsellor of Tiberius, L. Aelius Sejanus, whom he had appointed praetorian prefect, and who saw how his own position would be strengthened by a concentration of the forces under his command. The financial policy of Tiberius was careful and successful. The expenses of supplying Rome with corn and feeding the populace grew larger in his reign than they had been under Augustus. But in spite of this Tiberius was so economical that he was always able to act liberally in special emergencies. He did not waste the funds of the state in donatives or costly buildings. The only public edifices built by his command were the Temple of Augustus and the Theatre of Pompey. But when many of the famous cities of Asia were laid in ruins by an earthquake, Tiberius succoured them with the princely gift of 10,000,000 sesterces (£80,000), and caused the senate to remit to the inhabitants the payment of their tribute for 5 years. He had himself to supply the deficiency in the aerarium. We find him, in 33 A.D., bestowing on that treasury 100,000,000 sesterces (£800,000), and in 36 A.D. he gave the same sum for the relief of the sufferers in a great conflagration on the Aventine Hill. He never raised the rate of taxation. When Cappadocia became a province, on the strength of the addition which thus accrued to the revenue he reduced the tax of 1% on the sale of goods to 0.5%. The liberality of Tiberius in coming to the relief of the provinces, in the case of disasters, introduced a new principle into Roman statesmanship. Men were beginning to see that Rome, the mistress, had duties towards her subject lands. This policy of Tiberius is, as has been observed, one of the first signs of the reaction of the provinces upon Rome. It was, indeed, in the exercise of his proconsular functions that Tiberius most conspicuously showed himself as a wise and large-minded statesman. If he was hated at Rome, he was loved in the provinces. There is ample testimony to prove that his reign was, to the subjects, a period of unusual happiness. The discipline of the troops was strictly maintained, and the control exercised over the conduct of the governors was efficient and severe. The means of obtaining justice against oppression were facilitated, and under no reign were there so many prosecutions of governors and procurators for extortion. Besides this, the burdens were never increased, and the new principle of keeping the same governor at his post for a long time seems to have worked satisfactorily. See Pompeius Sabinus, legatus of Macedonia and Achaia, which Tiberius had united in a single imperial province (15 A.D.), held that office throughout almost the whole reign. The imperial provinces were, as a rule, more equitably ruled than the senatorial. This is shown clearly under Tiberius by the number of cases in which proconsuls were condemned for maladministration. The subjects themselves considered it a piece of good fortune to be transferred from the government of the senate to that of the emperor. Tiberius expressed his provincial policy in saying that "it is the part of a good shepherd to shear his sheep, not to flay them." The especial regulation which made the governors responsible for acts of rapacity on the part of their wives deserves notice. If he cared for the provinces, Tiberius did not neglect to help and guide the senate in promoting the welfare of Italy. He provided for the public safety and the security of travellers against robbers by stationing troops in various parts of the country, and all disturbances were promptly suppressed. He also concerned himself for the revival of agriculture, which had been slowly and surely declining in Italy during the past century, owing to the disappearance of the population of free labourers, so that the peninsula was dependent on foreign supplies for her maintenance. A serious economic crisis occurred in 33 A.D., and the emperor was obliged to interpose in order to save credit. The professional accusers, delatores, made an attack upon the money-lending capitalists, who had been systematically acting in defiance of 2 laws of Julius Caesar. One of these laws forbade any one to have more than 60,000 sesterces £480 of ready money in hand. The rest of each man's property was to be invested in lands and houses in Italy. The other regulated the relations between the lenders and borrowers, and the amount of interest. The matter came before the city praetor Gracchus, who thought it necessary to refer the question to the senate, as so many people were concerned. But the senators themselves were all guilty of transgressing the law, and so they appealed to the Emperor. He granted a year and 6 months, within which term every one was to arrange his accounts in conformity with the law. The usurers immediately called in their loans, and a large number of the debtors, in order to meet their obligations, were obliged to sell their estates. It was foreseen that this would lead to a scarcity of money, and, in order to keep specie in circulation, a senatus consultum in the spirit of Caesar's law was passed, that every creditor should have at least 2/3 of his capital invested in estates in Italy. But the remedy proved only an aggravation of the evil, for the creditors hoarded up their money to buy land cheap, and the value of estates fell so much that the debtors could not pay their debts. Many families were ruined. But at length Tiberius came to their rescue, and advanced 100,000,000 sesterces as a loan fund, from which any debtor might borrow, for 3 years without interest, on giving security to the state for double the amount. By this means credit was restored, and the remaining debtors were enabled to save their estates or get the legitimate value for them. Tiberius paid special and minute attention to the administration of justice. He introduced a new and salutary regulation, that 9 days should intervene between the sentence and its execution, in the case of culprits condemned by the senate. That body became, in his reign, the High Court of Criminal Justice. But the Emperor exercised paramount control over its decisions, and in all cases which affected his own interest, the senate merely expressed what they knew to be his will. In legislation Tiberius was also active. The Lex Junia Norbana, 19 A.D., was a measure to protect such freedmen as had not been strictly emancipated, but were released from slavery by their masters. This law rendered them independent of their masters for life, and gave them commercium without connubium, or, as it was called, Juniana Latinitas. They could neither bequeath property by will, nor receive bequests from others. The equestrian class was also limited by a senatus consultum, which excluded those whose grandfathers were not freeborn, and who did not possess a fortune of 400,000 sesterces £32,000. In his endeavours to reform abuses and suppress nuisances in Rome and Italy, the Emperor increased and confirmed his unpopularity. He limited the number of gladiators in the arena, and on the occasion of a riot in the theatre he expelled the players from the city. He made a vain attempt to banish soothsayers from Italy. He tried to suppress the Oriental rites, which were making themselves a home in Rome. He forbade especially the worship of Isis, and cast her statue into the river. He also adopted severe measures against Jews, who possessed Roman citizenship in Italy. They had attempted to evade military service, and on this ground were regarded as bad subjects, and their rights were forbidden. 4,000 Jew freedmen were transported to Sardinia, and set the task of reducing the robbers who infested that unhealthy island. The limitation of the right of asylum may also be mentioned here, though it chiefly affected the eastern part of the empire, where many places of refuge had been established for the protection of criminals. These religious refuges secured immunity to crime, and they had become public nuisances. Tiberius could do little to combat the prevailing luxury and dissipation among the higher classes. Frugal and moderate himself, he deeply disapproved of the extravagance of the aristocracy, and the absurd sums which were spent on furniture and the luxuries of the table. But he saw clearly that sumptuary laws were futile, and he said publicly that the time was not fit for a censorship. He was careful to keep up the state religion which Augustus had revived. His mother Livia sat in public among the Vestal Virgins, and the priests of the newly founded college of the Sodales Augustales, who were to preserve the worship of the divine Augustus, consisted of the leading senators. The part of the policy of Tiberius which perhaps did the most to render him disliked by both contemporaries and posterity was the new interpretation which he gave to maiestas. This crime was properly an offence against the abstract majesty of the commonwealth, and it came to include anything tending to bring the state into contempt. A lex Julia of Caesar had defined strictly the various forms which the maiestas might assume, and had been extended by Augustus, who, however, had made little use of it. But Tiberius seized on the law of maiestas as a means for his own security, and under him treason became an offence against the person of the Emperor, who thus comes to be regarded as the state. Any insult offered to the Princeps in either speech or writing was brought under the head of maiestas. Tiberius did not deem himself safe against treachery, and he decided to resort to this engine, which could not fail to be abused and bring odium upon him. It was an instrument by the fear of which he hoped to control the senators, and prevent them from expressing a dissentient view, lest it should be construed as treason. The case of Lutorius Priscus shows how outrageously his safeguard could be abused. Priscus was a knight who had written verses on the death of Germanicus, and had received from Tiberius a gift as a reward. Some time later Drusus fell ill, and Priscus, encouraged by his former success, composed a poem on Drusus to be published in case the prince should not recover. But though Drusus did not die, the poet could not resist the pleasure of reading his composition to an audience, and the consequence was that the matter became known, and he was accused before the senate. The senate found him guilty of counting on the death of a Caesar. Only 2 senators proposed that he should be leniently dealt with, as his act was due to thoughtlessness, not to evil intent. But he was condemned to death, and the sentence was forthwith carried out. Tiberius was absent from Rome when this happened, and when he returned he regretted the occurrence, and praised the view of the small minority. The affair of Priscus led to the regulation already mentioned, that a delay should intervene between the sentence and the infliction of punishment. The evils of this unhappy extension of the scope of maiestas were aggravated by the encouragement which was given by Tiberius to the delatores. Originally the delator was one who apprised the officers of the exchequer of debts that were due to the senate. The name was extended to those who informed in the cases of offences which were subject to fines. Augustus encouraged delation by offering rewards to those who lodged information against the violators of his marriage laws. Delation soon became a regular profession, and as there was no public prosecutor, it was very convenient to the government to have prosecutions conducted by private delators. When Tiberius came to the throne, he regarded delation as an admirable instrument for securing the administration and enforcement of justice, and therefore encouraged it. But when he discovered how terribly it was abused and how odious it was to his subjects, he concluded that it was too dangerous a remedy, and set himself to check it, for he was honestly anxious to administer justice purely and strictly. The citizens lived in fear and terror of the unscrupulous informers, and Tiberius tried to hinder the distortion of the laws by instituting a tribunal of 15 senators. But he relapsed afterwards into countenancing the practice of delation, owing to the influences of the praetorian prefect Sejanus, and as the law of treason became more comprehensive and extravagant, the delators became more terrible. End of chapter 13, section 1. Chapter 13, sections 2 and 3 of J.B.Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnall Bury. Chapter 13. The Principate of Tiberius, continued. Section 2 and 3. Section 2. Rise of Sejanus. Death of Drusus. The death of Germanicus removed difficulties from the path of Tiberius in regard to the succession. It had been difficult for him to hold the balance evenly between Germanicus and his own son. How precisely he endeavoured to make no distinction between them is shown by a coin of Sardis, where Drusus comes first in the inscription, but Germanicus sits on the right hand in the picture. Drusus was morally and intellectually inferior to his cousin, but was deeply attached to him, and after his death acted as a father to his children. The attitude of Tiberius to Germanicus seems to have been much like that of Augustus to Tiberius himself. From a feeling of duty to the state, he might acquiesce in the designation of his nephew as his successor, but his affection prompted him to prefer Drusus, though the father and son were not always on the best of terms. After the mysterious death of Germanicus, he set himself to secure the succession of Drusus, to the exclusion of his nephew's children. Ovations had been decreed to both the young Caesars for the successful discharge of their tasks in Armenia and Illyricum. The pacifier of Armenia never returned to Rome, but Drusus celebrated his ovation in 20 A.D., and in the following year held the consulship for the second time. In 22 A.D. his father raised him to the position of an imperial consort, by causing the senate and the people to confer upon him the tribunician power. But though the Emperor seemed to have cause to regard his nephew's death as a piece of good luck, his hopes for his son were destined to be frustrated. Drusus had married the sister of Germanicus, the younger Livia, generally called Livilla to distinguish her from the wife of Augustus. She was beautiful, ambitious, and unscrupulous, and seems to have had an ally in her namesake, the Augusta. She was seduced into an intrigue with Sejanus, the handsome and powerful prefect of the guards, who pretended to be in love with her and flattered her ambitious hopes with promises of marriage and the imperial throne, if the hindrance which stood in their way were once removed. Sejanus was a native of Volsinii in Etruria, and belonged to the equestrian class. In his youth he had served on the staff of Gaius Caesar. By his address and tact he had worked himself into the confidence of Tiberius, and had at length become indispensable as an adviser and semi-official minister. The Emperor did not dream how high the ambition of his favourite soared, for Sejanus was not content with being the right hand of his master, he longed to occupy himself the highest position in the state. But Tiberius was thoroughly blinded by his useful and servile instrument, and used to throw off his habitual reserve in his intercourse with Sejanus. He even went so far as to call the prefect, not only in private conversation, but in his addresses to the senate and people, the associate of my labours, and allowed his busts to be placed in the theatres and fora. But these marks of favour were given freely, just because it never entered the thought of Tiberius that a man of the origin and position of Sejanus could possibly be dangerous. Drusus saw more deeply into the character of his father's favourite, and murmured at the influence which an alien hand had acquired at the expense of a son. On one occasion he raised his hand to strike the hated prefect. Sejanus, who had already begun to pave his way to the throne by arranging an alliance between his own daughter and a son of Claudius, the brother of Germanicus, determined to sweep Drusus from his path. Suddenly Drusus died (23 A.D.), seemingly of an accidental illness, but 8 years after it was discovered that poison had been administered to him by the machinations of his wife Livilla and her paramour Sejanus. It was a heavy blow to Tiberius. The children of his son were still too young to be designated as his successors, and nothing was left but to adopt Nero and Drusus, the eldest sons of Germanicus. He led the youths before the senate and recommended them as the future rulers of the state. Sejanus, who had divorced his wife Apicata, proposed to marry Livilla, but Tiberius forbade the union, which could only lead to new candidates for power. The prefect was driven to frame new plans. He resolved to destroy the family of Germanicus. Tiberius was now surrounded by 4 imperial widows, who made his court a scene of perpetual jealousy and intrigue. These were his mother Livia and his daughter-in-law Livilla, his sister-in-law Antonia, and Agrippina. The will of Augustus had left Livia a share in the supreme power, and she desired to exert it. Her name appeared with that of her son on the imperial rescripts. Tiberius was unable to shake off her influence, while he deprecated her interference in public affairs, and she had a strong party of adherents in the senate, who proposed to call her Mater Patriae. The ambition of the strong-minded Agrippina had been disappointed by the death of her husband, but she hoped to rise again through her children. Her chastity and fertility made her an ideal Roman matron, but she had a violent temper and an unbridled tongue. She regarded the Emperor as her natural enemy, and the leniency which was shown to her rival Plancina filled her with resentment. Nor was she satisfied even when her sons, Nero and Drusus, were marked out as the successors of Tiberius. The fulfilment of her ambitious dreams seemed still too far away. After the death of Drusus, Tiberius leaned more and more on Sejanus, and from this period the Romans remarked a degeneration in the home government. The prefect worked on the Emperor's fears by pretending to discover conspiracies against him, and many acts of cruelty were committed. But it must be noted that this change for the worse affected only the circles of nobles and officials, and did not involve any deterioration in the general prosperity of the Empire. Many victims in high positions were sacrificed unjustly to suspicion and intrigue, but the Roman world as a whole was well governed. The key to the tyranny which marked the second half of the principate of Tiberius is probably to be found in his knowledge that Agrippina had a large party of sympathizers in the senate, who, after the death of Drusus, joyfully looked forward to the succession of her children. This party he and Sejanus determined to crush out. The first victim attacked by Sejanus was C. Silius, whom we have seen doing good work on the northern frontiers, and whose wife was a friend of Agrippina. He was accused of having connived at the rebellion of Sacrovir and of extortion, and the charges pressed him so hard that he committed suicide before sentence was passed. His wife was banished, and his possessions, said to have been wrung from the provincials of Gaul, were confiscated. It is doubtful whether Cremutius Cordus, a Stoic philosopher, and author of Annals of the Republic during the period of the civil wars, was also a partisan of Agrippina. In his work he had called Cassius the last of the Romans, and although Augustus had read the book and found no fault in it, this expression was now 25 A.D. made a cause of accusation against him. It was said that his work was an attempt to excite a rebellion. Cremutius, thinking that his case was prejudged, delivered a bitter speech in the senate, and returning home, starved himself to death. All that could then be done was to burn his books. In the following year, 26 A.D., the Dolators attacked Agrippina through her cousin Claudia Pulchra. They charged this lady with the crime of adultery, and also with having made attempts on the Emperor's life by poison and magic. Thereupon Agrippina sought the presence of Tiberius, and found him sacrificing to the divinity of his father. "The same man," she cried, "cannot offer victims to the divine Augustus and persecute his posterity." Stung by the reproaches which she heaped upon him, Tiberius quoted a Greek verse to this effect: "My daughter, have I done you wrong because you are not a queen?" On the news of the condemnation of her cousin, Agrippina fell dangerously ill. When Tiberius visited her, she besought him to permit her to take a second husband. To such a step there were the same objections which he had opposed to the union of Livilla and Sejanus, but Tiberius deemed it more prudent not to urge them then, and he left the room abruptly. This anecdote was told in the memoirs of Agrippina's daughter, the mother of Nero. Such scenes as these were calculated to widen the breach between Agrippina and Tiberius, and suspicions of her kinsman were artfully distilled, by the contrivance of Sejanus, into the mind of the princess. She became possessed of the idea that the emperor was planning to poison her, and when she was invited to sup with him, she absolutely refused to partake of any of the food that was presented to her. This undisguised declaration of her suspicions alienated the emperor still more. SECT. 3. Tiberius at Capreae. Influence of Sejanus and his fall. Hitherto Tiberius had resided continually at Rome and devoted himself assiduously to the conduct of affairs. He had constantly talked of visiting the provinces, and even made the preliminary arrangements for the journey, but when it came to the point he had always found a pretext for not going. He never went further from the city than Antium. But as he grew older, in 26 A.D. he had reached the age of 67, his reserve, his distrust of his fellow creatures, his dislike to the pomp of public life, seemed to have increased. He had always been reserved, sensitive, and shy. His temper had been soured by disappointments, both in his early life and in his recent years. His unpopularity in Rome, of which he was fully conscious, may have irritated him more as he became older, and his domestic life was full of worry, with Livia and Livilla on one side, and Agrippina on the other. All this might be enough to explain the motives which led him to take the momentous step of abandoning Rome and living permanently elsewhere. But if such motives operated, their effect was supported by the persuasions of the favourite Sejanus, who desired nothing better than to remove the emperor to a distance, so as to have a free scene for his own plans. It is possible, however, that Tiberius may have been decided by a political motive. he may have wished to give Nero, the eldest son of Germanicus, an opportunity of gradually undertaking an active part in the government, and assisting him somewhat as he had himself assisted Augustus. Silly and malicious stories were circulated by the Emperor's enemies. It was said that he sought a place of concealment for the practice of licentiousness, or that he wished to hide from the public view a face and figure deformed by old age. He left Rome, 26 A.D., on the pretext of consecrating a temple of Jupiter at Capua, and a temple of Augustus at Nola, recently built. His attendants were one senator, Cocceius Nerva, 2 knights, Sejanus and another, and some men of science and astrologers. During the Emperor's progress in Campania, an accident happened, which increased his confidence in Sejanus. The imperial party were dining at a country house called the Cave, Spelunca, formed of a natural grotto between the Gulf of Amyclae and the hills of Fundi. The rocks at the entrance suddenly fell in and crushed some of the servants, and the guests fled in panic. Sejanus placed himself in front of the Emperor, and received the falling stones. The incident convinced Tiberius that his prefect was a man who had no care for himself. Having dedicated the temples, he proceeded to the little island of Capreae, which Augustus, struck by its salubrious climate, had purchased from the people of Neapolis. Lonely and difficult to approach by its precipitous lime cliffs, yet near enough to the mainland, this island, about 11 miles in circuit and rising at either end to higher points of vantage, was an attractive retreat for the wearied statesman. 12 villas were built in Tiberias in various parts of the island, which was vigilantly guarded from intrusion. But while his subjects thought that he had entirely relinquished the conduct of affairs to the praetorian prefect, and was spending his days in consultation with his astrologers or in foul debauchery, Tiberius still bestowed constant attention to the details of public business. But he no longer troubled himself to suppress the servility of the senate, or to check the abuses of delation. Many innocent men were betrayed by the indefatigable informers, and the senators lived in fear and peril of their lives. The case of Titus Sabinus, a Roman knight who was tried and put to death in 28 A.D., was an episode in the struggle between Sejanus and the party of Agrippina, to which Sabinus belonged. Sabinus, who had been a friend of Germanicus, had made himself conspicuous by the attention which he paid to the wife and children of that prince after his death. 4 ex-praetors, who wished to obtain the consulship and sought for that purpose to ingratiate themselves with Sejanus, conceived the idea that the destruction of Sabinus would be an effectual means of winning the favourite's favour. Accordingly they laid a plot. One of them, named Latinius Latiaris, who was slightly acquainted with Sabinus, entered one day into conversation with him, praised him for not having abandoned the house of Germanicus in the hour of adversity, and spoke in compassionate terms of Agrippina. Sabinus, who was of a soft nature, took Latiaris completely into his confidence, burst into invectives against the cruelty of Sejanus, and did not spare Tiberius himself. Several treasonable conversations took place, but as it was necessary to have more witnesses, and as Sabinus would not have spoken freely in the presence of others, the 3 accomplices hid themselves between the ceiling and the roof in a room in the house of Latiaris, who induced Sabinus to visit him there on the plea of making a disclosure. The utterances of the entrapped knight on this occasion were quite sufficient for his condemnation, and the conspirators immediately dispatched a letter to the Emperor informing him of the treason of Sabinus. Tiberius, in his letter to the senate on January 1, 28 A.D., mentioned the treasonable designs of Sabinus, and suggested that it might be well to punish him. The senate condemned him to death without hesitation, and received a letter of thanks from Tiberius, hinting, however, that he still apprehended treachery, but without mentioning names. He was supposed to allude to Agrippina and her son Nero. The year 29 A.D. was marked by the death of Livia, or, as she was publicly called, Julia Augusta, at the age of 86. Her funeral oration was pronounced by Gaius, the 3rd son of Agrippina, then in his 17th year. Tiberius did not regret his imperious mother. The funeral was marked by little ceremony. The senate was forbidden to decree her divine honours. Her will remained long unexecuted. The memory of Livia has been much wronged by history. The consort of Augustus is forgotten in the mother of Tiberius, and it is only remembered that she had done much to raise to the throne an unpopular ruler, whom the Romans cursed as a tyrant. There is no reason to suppose, however, that her influence, exerted in the interests of clemency, sometimes thwarted Sejanus, and it is worthy of notice that he did not carry out his design against Agrippina until after the death of Livia. It has ever been said that her death was a turning point in the reign. Her friends who, under her powerful protection, had ventured to speak somewhat boldly against the Emperor, were persecuted when she died. Conspicuous among these was the husband of the Emperor's divorced wife Vipsania, Asinius Gallus, who was confined in prison for 3 years and then put to death. The body of Livia had not been long bestowed in the mausoleum of Augustus, when the senate received a letter from Tiberius, containing charges against Agrippina and Nero. The son was charged with gross licentiousness, the mother with insolence and a contumacious spirit. There was no hint of disloyalty or treason, and the emperor did not signify what he wished the senate to do. The people assembled outside the doors of the senate house, and cried that the letter was a forgery, hinting that it was the work of Sejanus, and bearing aloft the images of Agrippina and Nero. A second message soon came from Capreae, rebuking the citizens for their rebellious behaviour, and urging the senate to take definite action on the charges against the accused. The servile senators found them guilty, and they were banished to barren islands, Agrippina to Pandateria, and Nero to Pontia. Agrippina's second son Drusus still remained, but his fall too was speedily contrived by Sejanus. Just as he had seduced Livilla to compass the death of the elder Drusus, so now he seduced Lepida, the wife of the younger Drusus, and suborned her to calumniate her husband to Tiberius. Drusus, who with his younger brother Gaius lived at Capreae, was sent to Rome as a mark of disgrace, and the senate hastened to declare him a public enemy. For the right of declaring an individual a public enemy, as of declaring war, still belonged to the senate. He was then arrested and imprisoned in the palace. The power of Sejanus had now reached its highest point. He was regarded with greater awe than the emperor himself. He seemed to be the true sovereign, and Tiberius the mere lord of an island, Nesiarch. Altars were raised and sacrifices offered before his statues, games were voted in his honour. But his fall was at hand. Tiberius had become jealous and suspicious of the designs of his minister, and the graver his suspicions became, the more assiduously did he seek to disguise them until the time should come for the final blow. He loaded the prefect with honours. He betrothed him to his granddaughter Julia, the widow of Nero, who had died in exile at Pontia, and he conferred on him the honour of being his colleague in the consulship. This honour also furnished him with a pretext of ridding himself of the prefect's presence at Capreae. Sejanus was sent to Rome and to perform the functions of the consuls on behalf of both himself and Tiberius, and he was received with abject flattery by the senate and people. The senate decreed the consulate to him along with Tiberius for 5 years, and he was disappointed when Tiberius insisted on resigning it in the 5th month, 31 A.D. The messages, which from time to time arrived from Capreae, were uncertain and puzzling. Tiberius intended to keep Sejanus in a state of restless uncertainty. He conferred upon him the proconsular power and raised him to the dignity of a priest, but at the same time he mentioned his nephew Gaius Caesar with great favour, and conferred a priesthood on him also. Sejanus felt uneasy, and besought Tiberius to allow him to return to Capreae to see his betrothed bride, who was ill. The request was refused on the ground that the emperor and his family were about to visit Rome. In a letter to the senate which arrived soon after, Sejanus was mentioned without the addition of his titles, and it was forbidden to yield divine honours to a mortal. Besides this, the enemies of the prefect were treated with favour. These things seemed to forebode disgrace, and Sejanus resolved to forestall his fall by overthrowing his master. A conspiracy was formed to kill Tiberius when he came to Rome, but Satrius Secundus, one of the conspirators, betrayed the plot to Antonia, and she hastened to reveal it to her brother-in-law. It would hardly have been safe to denounce openly the treason of Sejanus. To strike down the prefect of the praetorian guards required caution and cunning. Tiberius selected a trusted officer, Sertorius Macro, to succeed Sejanus as prefect, and instructed him how he was to proceed. When Macro reached Rome, October the 17th, it was midnight. He immediately sought the house of the consul Memmius Regulus, and, having revealed the purpose of his coming, caused him to summon a meeting of the senate, early in the morning, in the temple of Apollo on the Palatine. This place of meeting was perhaps chosen in order that, if a disturbance should arise, Drusus, who was a captive in the adjoining palace, might readily be produced. Macro then visited Graecinus Laco, the commander of the cohortes vigilum, and arranged with him that the approaches to the temple should be guarded. In the morning, as Sejanus was proceeding to the Senate, attended by an armed retinue, Macro met him and disarmed his suspicions by informing him that the business of the meeting would be to confer the tribunician power on Sejanus himself. This power was the only thing wanting to his association in the empire, and Sejanus thought that his highest ambition was about to be fulfilled. When Sejanus had entered the temple, Macro informed the praetorians that he had been appointed their new prefect, and returned with them to their camp, as soon as he had given the emperor's letter to the consuls. This great wordy epistle from Capreae, which sounded the doom of Sejanus, began with some remarks on general matters, and then proceeded to a slight rebuke of Sejanus, then passed to some indifferent matters again, and finally demanded the punishment of Sejanus himself and some of his intimate friends. During the long recital of the letter, the suspense of the audience was intense, for none knew how it would end. Then the senators, who had been heaping Sejanus with congratulations, left his side. The consul ordered the lictors to seize him, and he was hurried off to prison. The people showed how much they rejoiced in the fall of the hated tyrant by hurling down his statues. The senate, when they saw the temper of the populace, and as the praetorian guards did not intervene, met at a later hour of the same day in the Temple of Concord, and sentenced Sejanus to death. He was immediately strangled in the prison, and his corpse was dragged by the executioner's hook to the Scalae Gemoniae, according to the usual custom in the reign of Tiberius. His death was followed by the execution of his family and friends. The senate decreed that a statue of Liberty should be set up in the Forum, and that the anniversary of the traitor's fall should be solemnly kept as a day of deliverance. Tiberius had in the meantime been agitated with fear and suspense. He had a fleet in waiting, ready to bear him to the east, in case Macro failed in the enterprise, and he posted himself on the highest cliff of the island, to watch for the appointed signal of success or failure. The fall of Sejanus was a relief to him, but it was soon followed by a horrible revelation. Apicata, the divorced wife of the fallen prefect, sent to Tiberius a full account of the details of the death of Drusus, showing how it had been compassed by Sejanus and Livilla, and having revealed this long-kept secret, she put an end to her life. The revelation was confirmed by the testimony of the slaves concerned in the affair, and the guilty Livilla was punished with death. The overthrow of Sejanus brought no alleviation to the miseries of Agrippina in her island or her son Drusus in his prison. It is not clear why the emperor determined to destroy Drusus. Perhaps he thought that one so deeply injured would be dangerous if released. He allowed him to perish by starvation, and then wrote a letter to the senate, describing minutely the manner of his death, even the curses which in his last moments he had vented against Tiberius himself. The object of this strange communication, which excited the horror of the senators, is not evident. Perhaps it was intended to show beyond doubt that Drusus was really dead, for an impostor, pretending to be Drusus, had recently created some disturbances in Greece and Asia. The death of Agrippina by voluntary abstinence from food soon followed that of her son. The senate, at the emperor's wish, decreed that her birthday should be ill-omened, and remarked that her death took place on the anniversary of the execution of Sejanus, 18th October, 33 A.D. The bodies of her children were not admitted to the mausoleum of the family until the reign of Gaius, who exhumed them from the lowly tombs in which they had been thrown. The prosecutions of those who were supposed to have been connected with the conspiracy of Sejanus were protracted over a year, but at length, in 33 A.D., the emperor, weary of the proceedings, issued an order for the summary execution of all who were still detained in prison, whether men, women, or children. A certain Marcus Terentius, who was impeached in the senate on the ground of friendship with Sejanus, is reported to have made a bold speech. Others had repudiated their friendly relations with the fallen prefect, but he candidly acknowledged that he was the friend of Sejanus, had eagerly sought to be such, and was delighted when he succeeded. Do not think, fathers, he said, only of the last day of Sejanus, but of his 16 years of power. To be known even to his freedmen and hall porters was regarded as a distinction. Let plots against the state, conspiracies for the murder of the Emperor, be punished, but as to friendship, the same issue of our friendship to Sejanus must absolve alike you, Caesar, and us. Terentius was saved by his boldness, and his accusers were condemned to banishment or death, according to the nature of their previous offences. But if a rare senator spoke out boldly, most of the order made the fall of the minister an occasion for obsequiousness. Some went so far in their proposals that they drew upon themselves the ridicule or severe censure of Tiberius. Thus Togonius Gallus begged the Emperor to choose a number of senators, of whom 20 should be selected by lot as a bodyguard whenever he entered the Curia. This man had actually taken seriously a letter of the Emperor asking for the protection of a consul from Capreae to Rome. Tiberius, who had a fashion of combining jest and seriousness, thanked the senators for their kindness, but suggested several difficulties. Who were to be chosen? Were they to be always the same? Were they to be men who had held office, or youths? And would it not be strange to see persons taking up swords on the threshold of the senate house? But if he knew how to answer a fool according to his folly, he could also sharply rebuke an impertinence. Junius Gallio proposed that the praetorian soldiers, having served their allotted time, should have the right of sitting among the knights in the 14 rows of the theatre. Tiberius asked what he had to do with the praetorian guards, who received their commands and their rewards only from the imperator, and suggested that Gallio was one of the satellites of Sejanus, seeking to tamper with the soldiery. Gallio was then, in return for his flattery, expelled from the senate and banished from Italy. Recent experiences had aggravated the Emperor's suspicious nature. He became more difficult to access, and committed many acts of cruelty. His faithful adviser, Cocceius Nerva, who was his companion at Capreae, weary, it is said, of seeing the harshness of his sovereign, put himself to death, in spite of the prayers and remonstrances of Tiberius. Of the 20 members of the imperial consilium, there soon remained only 2 or 3. The others had been the victims of delation. Public report ascribed to Tiberius a life of bestial debauchery in the inaccessible island, and the Parthian king actually addressed to him an impertinent rebuke for his licentious habits, and called upon him to satisfy public opinion by committing suicide. There is little doubt that Tiberius lived licentiously, like most of the Roman nobles of those days. But there is no doubt also that his dissipations have been foully exaggerated. The circumstance that his life was prolonged to nearly 80 years without medical aid is enough to make us hesitate to accept the stories which were circulated about the orgies at Capreae. End of Chapter 13, Sections 2 and 3. Section 4 and 5 of J.B.Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1 by John Bagnall Bury, Chapter 13, The Principate of Tiberius. Section 4 to 5. Section 4. Parthia and the Eastern Question. Among other slanders, it was said that Tiberius in his island retreat was indifferent to the government of the empire. The rumour seems to have reached the Parthian court and encouraged the Parthian king Artabanus to assume a hostile attitude. The peace with Parthia was undisturbed until the death of Artaxerxes, king of Armenia, about 34 A.D. Artabanus, elated by a long and successful reign, and thinking that the old Tiberius would not be likely to undertake an eastern war, seized the opportunity to transfer Armenia from dependence on Rome to dependence on Parthia. He induced the Armenians to elect his son Arsaces as successor to Artaxerxes. He even seemed to court a war with Rome, and addressed insulting letters to the emperor, demanding the inheritance of his own rival Vonones, who had died in Cilicia, insisting on the old boundaries of Macedonia and Persia, and threatening that he would seize the territories possessed long ago by Cyrus and afterwards by Alexander the Great. Tiberius was unequal to the emergency. He conferred upon Lucius Vitellius, an able and resolute officer, the same powers which he had before conferred upon his nephew Germanicus, and sent him to the east, with orders to cross the Euphrates at the head of the Syrian legions if it should prove needful. At the same time he set up a rival to Arsaces in the person of Mithridates, brother of Pharasmanes, king of the Iberians, and stirred up both the Iberians and Albanians to support his claim by an invasion of Armenia. Mithridates gained possession of the Armenian capital, Artaxata, and his rival Arsaces was removed by poison. King Artabanus then sent another of his sons, Orodes, to take the place of Arsaces, and recover Armenia, but the Parthian cavalry proved no match for the Caucasian infantry and the Sarmatian mounted archers, which supported Pharasmanes and Mithridates. A lively description of the warfare has come down to us. Pharasmanes challenged Orodes to battle, taunted him when he refused, rode up to the Parthian camp, and harassed their foraging parties. The Parthians at length became impatient and called upon their prince to lead them to battle. In the fight which ensued every variety of warfare was to be witnessed. The Parthians, accustomed to pursue or fly with equal skill, deployed their cavalry, and sought scope for the discharge of their missiles. The Sarmatians, throwing aside their bows, which at a shorter range are effective, rushed on with pikes and swords. There were alternate advances and retreats, then close fighting, in which, breast to breast with the clash of arms, they drove back the foe or were themselves repulsed. The Albanians and Iberians seized the Parthian riders, and hurled them from their horses. The Parthians were thus pressed on one side by the cavalry on the heights, on the other by the infantry in close quarters. The leaders, Pharasmanes and Orodes, were conspicuous, encouraging the brave, succouring those who wavered, and at length recognizing each other they rushed to the combat on galloping chargers and with poised javelins. The force of Pharasmanes was greater, he pierced the helmet of the foe. But he was hurried onward by his horse, and before he could repeat the blow with deadlier effect, Orodes was protected by his guards. But the rumour spread among the Parthians that their general was slain, and they yielded. After the ill success of both his sons, Artabanus took the field himself. It was now the moment for Vitellius to intervene. He set his troops in motion, and threatened to invade Mesopotamia. This was the signal for the outbreak of an insurrection which had been long brewing in Parthia, and had been fomented by Roman intrigues. The Parthian nobles, dissatisfied with the rule of the Scythian Artabanus, clamoured for the restoration of a true Arsacid. There was still a surviving son of Phraates at Rome, and a section of the disaffected Parthians sent a secret embassy to Tiberius, requesting that this representative of the house of Arsaces should be sent to the east as a claimant to the Parthian throne. This suited the views of Tiberius, and he acceded to the request. But the candidate for sovereignty died in Syria, and Tiberius then chose Tiridates, a grandson of Phraates, to take his place. The appearance of Vitellius and Tiridates in the Parthian dominions was attended at first with complete success. Sennaces, a man of good family and great wealth, and his father Abdageses, were the leaders of the party hostile to Artabanus, which was largely increased after the disasters in Armenia. Artabanus had soon found himself deserted except by a few foreigners, and was compelled, in order to save his life, to flee into exile among the Scythians. Tiridates then, under the protection of Vitellius and the Roman legions, crossed the Euphrates on a bridge of boats. The first Parthian to enter the camp was Ornospades, formerly a Parthian exile, who had been made a Roman citizen in recognition of aid which he had given to Tiberius in the Dalmatian war, and subsequently returning to Parthia had been received into favour and appointed governor of Mesopotamia. Sennaces and Abdageses arrived soon afterwards with the royal treasure. Then Vitellius, having thus given Tiridates a start, and displayed the Roman eagles beyond the Euphrates, returned with his army to Syria. Nicephorium, Anthemusius, and other towns of Greek foundation, gladly received the new king, expecting him to be a good ruler from his Roman training. The enthusiasm shown by the powerful city of Seleucia, which had preserved intact its Greek character under Parthian domination, was especially encouraging. But Tiridates made a fatal mistake in losing time. Instead of pressing forward into the interior of the country, he delayed over the siege of a fortress in which Artabanus had stored away his treasures and his concubines. In the meantime quarrels broke out among his adherents, some of whom, jealous of the influence of Abdageses, and regarding Tiridates as a Roman dependent, decided to restore Artabanus. They found the exiled monarch in Hyrcania, covered with dirt and sustaining life by his bow. At first he thought that they intended treachery, but when he was assured that they desired his restoration, he hastily raised some auxiliaries in Scythia and marched against Seleucia with a large force. In order to excite sympathy, he retained the miserable dress which he had worn in his exile. The party of Tiridates retreated into Mesopotamia and soon dispersed, Tiridates himself returning to Syria, 36 A.D., and leaving Artabanus master of the realm, except Seleucia, which was strong enough to hold out. Vitellius again threatened Mesopotamia, but the restored monarch hastened to yield to the Roman demands, and a peace was concluded. Artabanus recognized Mithridates as king of Armenia, while the Romans undertook not to support the pretensions of Tiridates. The Parthian king also did homage to the image of the Roman emperor, and gave up his son Darius as a hostage. Section 5. Last days and death of Tiberius. Tiberius was not indifferent to the selection of a successor, though he is reported to have once said, quoting the verse of a Greek poet, "When I am dead, let earth be wrapped in flame." There were 3 male representatives of his house on whom his choice might fall. There was his nephew Tiberius Claudius Drusus, the youngest son of the elder Drusus, but he was considered out of the question, as being of weak intellect. There was his grand-nephew Gaius, born in 12 A.D., the youngest son of Germanicus, and there was his grandson Tiberius Gemellus, born 19 A.D., son of Drusus and Livilla. Between these two the choice was practically to be made. The emperor had for a long time slighted Gaius, as being a son of Agrippina, and had not permitted him to assume the toga virilis until his 19th year. But Gaius began to rise, when Sejanus began to decline, in favour. He carefully dissembled any emotions he may have felt at the fate of his mother and brothers, and the people looked forward with satisfaction to a son of Germanicus on the throne. On the other hand, Tiberius may have secretly wished for the succession of his grandson. In 35 A.D. he made a will leaving Gaius and Gemellus joint heirs of his private fortune, and this was equivalent to an expression of his wish that they should be joint heirs of the empire. But there is reason to believe that he regarded Gaius as his successor. The 4 daughters of Germanicus had been married to men of note. Agrippina, of whom we shall hear more, to Cn. Domitius, Drusilla to Cassius Longinus, Julia to Vinicius, the patron of Velleius Paterculus the historian, and a 4th, of unknown name, to the son of Quintilius Varus. His own granddaughter Julia, the widow of Nero, and the betrothed of Sejanus, he married to Rubellius Blandus, a knight of obscure origin. The praetorian prefect Macro, who now partly occupied the place which Sejanus had formerly held at Capreae, saw that Gaius was probably destined to succeed, and sought to obtain an ascendancy over him. Gaius had lost his wife, the daughter of M. Junius Silanus, in the 3rd year of their marriage, and Macro engaged his own wife Ennia to enthrall the young man by her arts and charms. The sharp old emperor observed the policy of the prefect, and said to him, "You leave the setting sun to court the rising." In the 78th year of his age, in the first months of 37 A.D., Tiberius quitted his island, never to return. He travelled slowly towards Rome and advanced along the Appian Way within 7 miles of the city. He gazed for the last time at the tops of the distant buildings, but frightened by some evil omen, turned back and retraced his steps southward. He was fading fast. At Circeii, in order to hide his weakness, he presided at military exercises, and in consequence of the over-exertion became worse. He tried till the last to conceal his condition from those who were with him, and his physician Charicles had to resort to an artifice to feel his pulse. He breathed his last in the villa of Lucullus at Misenum on March 16, 37 A.D. It was whispered that his end was hastened by Macro, who, seeing him suddenly revive, stifled him. In estimating Tiberius, we must take into account the circumstances of his life, and also the character of the witnesses who have recorded his reign. A Claudian, both on his father's and on his mother's side, descended from the Neros to whom, as Horace sang, Rome owed so much, he had all the pride of his patrician house. He was strong, tall, well made, and healthy, with a fair complexion and long hair profuse at the back of his head, a characteristic of the Claudii. He had unusually large eyes, and a serious expression. In youth he was called the Old Man, so thoughtful was he and slow to speak. He had a strong sense of duty and a profound contempt for the multitude. The spirit of his ancestress, the Claudia who uttered the wish that her brother were alive again, to lose another fleet and make the streets of Rome less crowded, had in some measure descended upon Tiberius. He was, as the originally Sabine name Nero signified, brave and vigorous, and had a conspicuous aptitude for the conduct of affairs. But he was too critical to have implicit confidence in himself, and he was suspicious of others. His self-distrust was increased by the circumstances of his early manhood. His reserved manner, unlike the geniality of his brother Drusus, could not win the affection of his stepfather Augustus, who regarded his peculiarities as faults. And indeed, when he was young enough to have ambition, he was made use of indeed, but he never enjoyed imperial favour. Kept, when possible, in the second place, he was always meeting rebuffs. He was forced to divorce Vipsania and marry Julia, who brought him nothing but shame. Thus the circumstances of his life and his relations to his stepfather were calculated to deepen his reserve, to embitter his feelings, and produce a habit of dissimulation, so that there is little wonder that a man of his cold, diffident nature, coming to the throne at the age of 55, should not have won the affections of subjects whom he did not deign to conciliate. All his experiences tended to develop in Tiberius that hard spirit, rigor animi, so clearly stamped on his features in the large sitting statue which has been preserved. On the other hand, his diffidence made him dependent on others, first on Livia, and then on Sejanus, who proved his evil genius. In regard to the darker side of his policy as a ruler, we must remember that he had undertaken a task which necessarily involved inconsistencies. He undertook to maintain the republican disguise under which Augustus had veiled the monarchy. The wearing of a mask well suited his reserved and crafty nature, but the success of this pretence depended far more upon personal qualities than Tiberius realized. It had been a success with Augustus because he was popular and genial. It was a failure with Tiberius because he was just the opposite. After Tiberius, the mask was dropped. The system of delation and the law of maiestas were provided by Tiberius as a substitute for the popularity which had shielded his predecessor from conspiracy. Owing to the spread of delation, the reign of Tiberius was to some extent a reign of terror. Hardly any important works of literature were produced, for men did not care to write when they could not write freely. We have already seen the fate of the historian Cremutius Cordus. Two other historians, whose works have come down to us, escaped censure by flattery. In the case of one, the flattery was probably sincere. Velleius Paterculus, whose short Roman history in 2 books was published in 30 A.D., had served under Tiberius in the Pannonian War, and had afterwards risen to the rank of quaestor, and then of praetor. He had conceived a deep admiration and affection for his general, and lauds him with extravagant superlatives. He also speaks in very high terms of Sejanus, who had not yet fallen. Valerius Maximus was more clearly a time-server. In his 9 books of memorable deeds and words, a collection of anecdotes of Roman history, written in a tasteless, pretentious style, he is servile to the emperor. But as the work appeared after the fall of Sejanus, a vehement declamation against that minister is introduced. The Spaniard, Annaeus Seneca of Corduba, not to be confounded with his more famous son, was active under Tiberius as well as under Augustus. He wrote a history extending from the beginning of the civil wars almost to the day of his death, about 39 A.D., unfortunately not preserved, but his works on rhetorical subjects are partly extant. The terror of delation did not affect jurists like Masurius Sabinus, men of science like Celsus, or gastronomists like Apicus, owing to the politically indifferent nature of their subjects. It is not easy to see how it affected poetry, but Virgil and Horace had no immediate successors. The only poetical writer of the reign was the freedman Phaedrus, and he tells us that he was persecuted. He was the author of 5 books of Aesopian fables, in iambic trimeters. Pomponius Secundus wrote tragedies, but perhaps did not publish them till after the death of Tiberius. The emperor was himself imbued with letters. He wrote a lyric poem on the death of Lucius Caesar, and Greek verses in the style of the Alexandrine school. He also wrote memoirs of his own life. He was a strict purist in language, and resolutely refused to use words borrowed from Greek. This negative testimony of literature shows that delation was a very real danger and that the government of Tiberius was in some respects tyrannical. But he was not such a tyrant as he had been painted by the later writers Tacitus and Suetonius. Over against the dark picture of Tacitus we must set the opposite picture of the inferior artist Velleius, and we must allow for the bias of both authors. We must remember that Velleius had seen Tiberius at his best, in the camp conducting a campaign, that he received promotion from him and was prejudiced in his favour. In addition to this, he was writing in the emperor's lifetime. On the other hand, Tacitus wrote under the influence of a reaction against the imperial system, and he lays himself out to blacken the character of all the emperors prior to Nerva. The dark character of Tiberius, and a certain mystery which surrounded his acts and motives, lent themselves well to the design of the skilful historian, who gathered up and did not disdain to record all sorts of popular rumours and stories imputing crime to the exile of Capreae. Apart from the measures which he adopted for his own safety, or at the instigation of Sejanus, and which mainly concerned his own family and nobles connected with them, apart from the consequences of the system of delation, which were felt almost exclusively at Rome, there can be no question that the rule of Tiberius was wise and maintained the general prosperity of the empire. Augustus was not deceived when, in adopting his stepson into the Julian family, he said, "I do it for the public welfare." Nor, on the other hand, was he mistaken when he prophetically pitied the fate of the people of Rome, which he was committing to be masticated in the slow jaws of his adopted son. End of chapter 13, sections 4 to 5.
The ringleaders were given up and put to death. The revolt of the Rhine legions was a more serious danger. In Pannonia there was no question of setting up a rival emperor, but this danger existed on the Rhine. Germanicus Caesar, governor of Gaul and general of the 8 legions stationed on the German frontier, was marked out as the successor of Tiberius, his adoptive father, and the troops of Lower Germany conceived the design of hastening his reign. They not only demanded shorter service, higher pay, and lighter labour, but proclaimed their intention of carrying Germanicus to Rome and making him emperor. Germanicus was at the time absent in Lugudunum, occupied with the census of Gaul. Aulus Caecina, an experienced officer, was in command of the legions of the Lower Province, while Upper Germany had been assigned to C. Silius. When the news reached Germanicus, he hastened to his camp on the Lower Rhine, which lay in the land of the Ubii, and appeared in the presence of the mutineers. An exciting scene then took place, the soldiers beseeching their popular commander to right their wrongs, showing him the marks of their wounds and stripes, finally urging him to march to Rome and seize the sovereign power. Germanicus expostulating and praising the virtues of Tiberius. The excitement reached such a pitch that it was necessary to withdraw the general from the presence of the troops. It was a critical moment. The mutineers talked of destroying the town of the Ubii, Oppidum Obiorum, and plundering the cities of Gaul. the German foes beyond the Rhine would not fail to take advantage speedily of the broken discipline of the army. To restore order, Germanicus was forced to concede, in the name of Tiberius, the demands of the troops. He promised that the terms of service should be shortened, and that large donatives should be distributed. The legions then returned to their winter quarters, 2 under Germanicus to Oppidum Ubiorum, the other 2 under the legatus Aulus Caecina to Castra Vetra. But at this moment messengers arrived from Rome for the purpose of investigating the causes of the discontent, and when the soldiers saw that the concessions might fail to be ratified, the mutiny broke out more furiously than ever. Germanicus decided that his wife and children should leave the camp. It does not appear that he apprehended any serious danger on their account, for no measures were taken to conceal their flight. They departed in broad daylight, and in view of the whole camp. The sight of Agrippina carrying in her arms the little boy Gaius, who had been born and reared in the camp, and whom they had nicknamed Caligula, boots, from the Caligulae or military boots which they made him wear in sport, moved their hearts to remorse. The memory of her father Agrippa, her grandfather Augustus, her father-in-law Drusus, stirred their pride, and when they learned that her destination was the city of the Treveri, jealousy prompted them to make peace with their general. Germanicus seized on the propitious moment to work on their softened feelings, and recalled them to their duty. They fell on their knees before him, begged for forgiveness, and zealously delivered their ringleaders to punishment. It seems likely that this scene was expressly devised by Germanicus as a last resource for appealing to the nobler sentiments of the insurgents. Thus was the danger averted in the Euboean camp. In Castra Vetra the skilful management seriously meant. The first care of Tiberius was the funeral and deification of Augustus. The dead body was borne by senators to the Campus Martius, where it was burned and the ashes were bestowed in the imperial mausoleum. Funeral orations were pronounced both by Tiberius and by his son Drusus. The Senate decreed temples and priests to the Divus Augustus, who was thus raised to place beside his father, the Divus Iulius. His will, which had been deposited in the charge of the Vestal Virgins, was read before the Senate and thus published abroad. It bequeathed 2/3 of his fortune to Tiberius, and the remainder to Livia, who was to be adopted into the Julian family and bear the name Augusta. If these heirs failed, 1/3 of the property was to descend to Drusus, the son of Tiberius, and the remainder to Germanicus and his 3 sons. But these legacies were considerably diminished by the large donations which were left to the citizens and to the praetorian and legionary soldiers. Along with his fortune, the old emperor bequeathed, in his Brevarium Imperii, some councils of government. He deprecated the admission of provincials to the privileged position of Roman citizens. He condemned the further extension of the frontiers of Roman dominion, and he advised that as many men of ability as possible should be engaged in the administration of public affairs. It seems probable that the second of these councils specially regarded the conquest of Transrhenane Germany, and we shall see how Tiberius acted on it. Section 2. Germanicus on the Rhine. The first weeks of the reign of Tiberius were disturbed by mutinies in the Rhine and Danube armies. Discontent had long been smouldering, and had only been hindered from bursting forth by respect for the old emperor. The soldiers who defended the German frontiers contrasted the hardships which they were obliged to endure in harsh climates and remote regions, the small pay which they received, the unduly long term of service, and the inadequate provision awaiting them at its expiration, with the easy life and the higher pay of the praetorian guards who could look forward to gifts of land in Italy itself. On the news of the death of Augustus, mutinies broke out simultaneously on the Danube and on the Rhine. The Pannonian army, consisting of 3 legions, under the command of Julius Blasius, threw off the authority of their general, and demanded that the term of service should be reduced from 20 to 16 years, and that the veterans should receive their pensions in money. Blasius was forced to send his son to Rome, to bear these demands to the new emperor, and in the meantime the troops vented their pent-up wrath on the centurions, whom they most detested and refused to perform their military duties. Tiberius dispatched some praetorian cohorts under his son Drusus to treat with the mutineers and restore order, but sent no definite message of concession. The soldiers were enraged when they discovered that Drusus was instructed to evade rather than comply with their demands, and the young prince was with difficulty rescued from their fury. But an eclipse of the moon opportunely took place. The superstitious soldiers were alarmed, and, seized with a fit of remorse, they listened to the indefinite promises of Drusus and returned to their allegiance. The Principate of Tiberius, Sections 1 to 2. Section 1. Accession of Tiberius. It was generally regarded as a matter of course that Tiberius should step into the place of Augustus. The Roman world did not dream of a revolution, and it was felt that a monarchy naturally fell to him, who stood in the same relation to the now divine Augustus as Augustus himself to the divine Julius. Men universally acquiesced in the succession of Tiberius as the heir, the adopted son, the chosen cohort of the deceased emperor. But though such feelings moved men's minds, constitutionally the empire was elective, not hereditary, and the Senate and the people could, without infringing the constitution, have conferred the principate on someone wholly unconnected with the Julian family. Augustus had himself named 3 nobles who might possibly compete with Tiberius: Lepidus, who was equal to the position but despised it; Asinius Gallus, who might desire it but was unequal to it; and Arruntius, who was not unworthy of it and would dare to seek it if a chance were offered. But even from Arruntius, Tiberius had nothing to fear. The only possible rival seemed to be his own kinsman, his nephew Germanicus, who was absent in Gaul, and Agrippa Postumus, who was still pined in the island to which his grandfather had banished him. The unlucky Agrippa was slain by his gaoler immediately after the death of Augustus, and there can be no doubt that the order for his execution was given either by Tiberius or by Livia. When the death of Augustus was announced, Tiberius, by virtue of the tribunician power which he had received in the preceding year for an indefinite period, convoked the Senate. He had already given the watchword to the praetorian cohorts, and sent dispatches to the legions as if he were formally emperor. It is not quite clear whether this was formally an act of usurpation, for it might have been held that the proconsular imperium, which Tiberius possessed before the death of Augustus, having been bestowed by a decree of the Senate and not being merely derived from the imperium of the Princeps, did not cease on the death of the Princeps. In any case, the act seemed an anticipation of his election to the Principate, and Tiberius afterwards made a sort of apology for it to the Senate. But Senate and people, consuls and prefects, took an oath of obedience to him without a sign of hesitation. The proconsular imperium was renewed or confirmed, and the various rights which had been granted to Augustus by separate enactments were conferred upon him doubtless by single comprehensive law, lex de imperio. Tiberius, indeed, adopting the maxims of statecraft which he had learned from his predecessor, feigned reluctance to assume the immense task of directing such a vast empire, and suggested that the functions of government should be divided among more than one ruler. But it was easily seen that the suggestion was not intended seriously. It was part of the transparent comedy which was played henceforward between the Senate and the Princeps. It is important to observe that the practice adopted by Augustus of assuming the empire for a defined period of years was now abandoned. On the other hand, Tiberius would not assume it for life. No term was fixed, but he intimated his intention of resigning the principate when the state no longer needed him. Here again no one took his words, and of the experienced Caecina restored discipline, while at Mogontiacum the agitators who tried to stir to rebellion the army of the upper province seemed to have totally failed. The only peril which threatened the succession of Tiberius was thus hindered, and for this he had to thank the unshaken fidelity of his nephew. Germanicus had refused to listen when the troops tempted him to disloyalty. He declined to take the flood of the tide which might have led him to fortune. If he had marched to Rome at the head of the Germanic legions, he would have plunged the state once more in civil war. But it is not certain that he would have been the survivor. Germanicus was a man of considerable ability, and his affable manners and urbanity won him friends everywhere. In the camp he associated freely with the soldiers, and they idolized him. He had his father's gift of making himself popular, but he had not his father's genius. It was his dream, however, to restore the work which Drusus had so brilliantly begun, and carry the eagles of Rome once more to the Albis. Immediately after the suppression of the mutiny, the young Caesar decided to employ the discontented legions, who were themselves anxious for active service. Hostilities against the Germans had been slumbering for the past few years, but no treaty had been made since the defeat of Varus, so that in making a sudden incursion the Romans were formally justified. It had been questioned whether Germanicus was not exceeding his powers in taking the offence without the express permission of the emperor. But as he had been entrusted by Augustus with his large command for the purpose of conducting the war and defending the frontier against the Germans, it must clearly have been left to his discretion when he might advance and when he should retire. In the late autumn 14 A.D., the legions and cohorts of the lower province crossed the Rhine, cut their way through the Silver Caesar, and through the rampart which Tiberius had constructed after the Varian disaster as the limes of Roman territory. Thus they reached the land of the Marsi, who dwelt between the rivers which are now called Lippe and Ruhr. Caecina advanced in front with some light cohorts to reconnoitre and clear the way. It was discovered that the Marsi were to spend the night in solemn festivities, and when the Romans approached their villages after sunset, the inhabitants, unsuspicious and inebriated, offered an easy prey. The legions were divided into 4 wedges cunei, which devastated the country for 50 miles with fire and sword, sparing neither sex nor age. The holy places of the Marsi, especially the sacred precinct of the deity Tamphana, were levelled with the ground. The fate of the Marsi roused to arms neighbouring tribes, the Bructeri, who lived northward, the Tubantes, who dwelt on the Ruhr, and the Usipetes, between the Lapia and the Manus. They stationed themselves in the woods through which the Romans had to return, but the zeal of the legions and the skill of the commander shook off the enemy, and the winter quarters were safely reached. The revolt on the lower Rhine had caused serious anxiety at Rome, and especially to Tiberius, coming as it did in conjunction with the mutiny in Pannonia. The Pannonic army was nearer Italy. On the other hand, the Germanic army was far larger, and the emperor, uncertain in which of the camps his presence was more needful, and afraid of giving the preference to either, ended by remaining in Rome and watching the issue of events. The news that Germanicus had quelled the mutiny was a great relief, but it was suspected that the military success which he gained in his brief campaign was not so agreeable to Tiberius. If so, the emperor dissembled his jealousy, praised the achievement of his nephew in the presence of the Senate, and granted him the honor of a triumph. The following year was marked by two distinct invasions of Germany, which, however, hung closely together and were parts of a common design. Of all the German tribes, the Cherusci, the tribe of Arminius, was the most formidable and the most hostile. They had been the leaders in the fight for freedom, which ended in the Varian disaster. Against them, above all others, policy and revenge excited the spirit of Germanicus. His plan was to prevent the neighbouring peoples from assisting them, and then attack them alone. Their most powerful neighbours were the Chatti, and the first expedition was directed against them. 1. In the spring the 4 legions of the Lower Rhine crossed the river from Castra Vetra, under the command of Caecina, who was to prevent the tribes in that quarter, especially the Marsi and the Cherusci, from marching to aid the Chatti. Caecina's army was augmented by bands of the 6 renowned German tribes, Batavians, Ubii, Sugambri. Meanwhile Germanicus himself, at the head of the 4 legions of the Upper Rhine, advanced into the territory of Mount Taunus, and attacked the Chatti so suddenly that no serious resistance could be made. Their fortress Matium was destroyed. By this means the Chatti were prevented from making common cause with the Cherusci. That people was distracted at this time by domestic discords. Segestes was invoking the help of the Romans against his enemy and son-in-law Arminius, the hero of the Teutoburg forest. The messengers of Segestes reached Germanicus as he was returning to the Rhine, and besought him to relieve their master, who was blockaded by his enemies. The Roman army retraced their steps, entered the borders of the Cherusci, and delivered their ally, who was able in return to restore some of the spoils of Pharis and hand over some important hostages, among these his daughter Theuselda, the wife of Arminius. That warrior, infuriated at the capture of his wife, left nothing undone to stir up the passions of his nation, and he succeeded in winning over Inguomer, an influential noble who had hitherto sided with the Romans. 2. Germanicus and Caecina, who had signally defeated the Marsi, having returned to the Rhine, prepared for a grand expedition against the enemy, conceived on the same plan which Drusus had formerly adopted with success. The army was divided in 3 parts. Caecina led his legions through the land of the Bructeri to the banks of the upper Armisia. Germanicus and the 4 legions of the upper province embarked to coast along the shore of the North Sea, and enter the river at its mouth, while the cavalry under Peter Albinovanus, the poet, marched to the same goal through the land of the Frisi. Successfully united, the combined army laid waste far and wide the land between the Armisia and the Lypia. Here they were near the Saltus Teutoburgiensis, where the remains of Varus and his legions lay unburied, and Germanicus could not resist the desire of visiting the spot, erecting a mound over the white bones, and honouring